You ever think you could survive in medieval Ireland? Be honest. You've seen the green hills, misty cliffs, maybe imagined yourself walking barefoot through the heather, holding a basket of potatoes and humming some Gaelic tune. Yeah, now take that fantasy and set it on fire. Because the truth is, within 10 minutes of waking up in a real 13th century Irish farmstead, you'd be cold, itchy, mildly poisoned by smoke, and halfway to tetanus from stepping on your own floor. Welcome to the Drowsy Historian, where we tuck you into bed with the most uncomfortable, inconvenient, and downright awful corners of history. And tonight, we're taking you into the mud-soaked, mist-covered daily grind of a medieval Irish farmer. It's itchy, it's smoky, it's depressingly honest, and you'll never look at a potato the same way again. Chapter 1. Before the Rooster Crows. Waking in the Bodlands, imagine waking up not to an alarm clock, but to the stench of damp straw, the wheezing of a coughing pig 2 feet from your head, and a baby screaming because the fire went out again. Congratulations. You're now living in a 13th century Irish crannog, or ring fort dwelling, and it's about as glamorous as a compost heap on fire. Let's meet Éodáin, a lean, half-toothless farmer in his mid-30s, though he looks about 50. Why? Because he's survived smallpox, 3 famines, 2 cattle raids, and 1 very angry goose. His wife Mairead, just as sturdy, is already up feeding the animals, human and not. They share their tiny home with 4 kids, 2 cows, a chicken coop built into the wall, and enough fleas to start their own feudal system. The ceiling is a thick thatch roof, dripping dew and smoke, stained from the constantly burning peat fire that never quite vents properly. Ever wonder what it's like to marinate your lungs in slow roast mould and soot for 40 years? Éodáin could tell you, if his lungs still worked. This hut, called a clocan or a boulie, is 1 room. That's it. No privacy, no doors, no separation. Just 1 big miserable room full of breathing, snoring, farting humanity. And livestock. Because if you think the cows slept in a barn, the barn is your bed. That cow? That's your radiator. Now let's talk about mornings. There's no sun peeking through windows. There are no windows. Just a hole in the roof and smoke bleeding through the thatch like ghosts escaping purgatory. Mairead's already squatting by the embers, trying to boil some oats or barley into something vaguely edible. Breakfast, if you're lucky, is sour barley gruel, maybe with some goat milk if the goat wasn't stolen last night. The drink of choice? Water from the nearby stream. Never mind that the pigs also bathe there. It's medieval detox. Éodáin stumbles outside to relieve himself. There's no outhouse, just a muddy patch near the hedgerow. He's careful not to step in the family's waste trench, which doubles as fertilizer. Charming, right? And now the real fun begins, the chores. Because if you thought working from home was tiring, try living in a place where everything wants to kill you, including your dinner. First task, check if the thatch has sprung a leak. Second, milk the cow without getting kicked in the face. Third, check for signs of cattle theft. Cattle, by the way, are the real currency of medieval Ireland. Gold, coins, meh. You show wealth by how many mooing meat bricks you own. If someone steals your cow, it's not a theft, it's war. Éodáin's got a chipped spear leaning against the wall and 1 working eye ready for revenge raids. Cattle rustling isn't a crime, it's a national pastime. Let's pause here and zoom out. Historians like to romanticize rural medieval life. Simple, they say. Close to nature, they say. You know what else is close to nature? Worms. And Éodáin's got a few in his foot. Medieval Irish farmers didn't live with nature. They fought it daily. The soil, half bog, the rain, endless, the tools, wooden, the lifespan, short, the dental plan, non-existent. You didn't just plough a field, you begged it to cooperate, bribed it with manure, and still got punished by mildew or early frost. Or sheep. Yes, sheep. They're adorable today, but in medieval Ireland, sheep were sacred. Their wool clothed you, their milk kept babies alive, and their dung heated your home. You protected your sheep more than your kids some days. They were more valuable, less noisy too. Meanwhile, poor Mayreed is already spinning wool, preparing curds, and praying her neighbour Bridget doesn't hex the butter. Superstition wasn't just a belief, it was a survival strategy. You spilled milk? That's a fairy curse. Child fell ill? That's the puka. Your cow stopped giving milk? Definitely a neighbour's butter witch. And that brings us to sarcasm's favourite punching bag, medieval hygiene. Aodan hasn't bathed in weeks, maybe months. Why? Because bathing was seen as dangerous. Hot water opened your pores and let disease in, obviously. Better to stay crusty and blessed than clean and cursed. By now the kids are awake, covered in dirt, chewing on strips of boiled nettle like it's a treat. There's laughter, sure. There's resilience, definitely. But behind it all is a constant hum of survival. Life isn't about thriving, it's about not dying yet. Let's be real, this wasn't the noble savage lifestyle some people still fantasize about. This was slow-motion suffering in the name of tradition. Yes, there was community. Yes, there was connection to the land. But also, there was chronic malnutrition, no concept of personal space, and a healthcare system that involved holy water and wishful thinking. If you lived past 40, you were a wizard. If you had all your teeth, you were a witch. And so, as the rooster finally crows and the mist rolls off the hills, Aodan grips his hoe, Mayreed sighs over the fire, and a new day of repetition begins. For the medieval Irish farmer, the morning wasn't the start of something new. It was just the next round of an endless cycle: survive the cold, survive the work, survive each other. And tomorrow? Same bog, same barley, same barely hanging on hope. The sun hasn't even broken through the grey yet, and already Aodan is ankle-deep in mud, cursing at a fence post that refuses to stay upright. The bogland, so beautifully romantic in paintings, is a daily enemy. Every step is a gamble. One wrong move and you're knee-deep in peat, or worse face first, in someone else's manure pile. And that's not a metaphor. The fields aren't even really fields. They're cleared patches of swamp with just enough grudging soil to pretend they're arable. Welcome to medieval Irish agriculture, where the land doesn't just hate you, it wants you dead. Aodan tries not to step on the broken stone blade he dropped yesterday. Iron tools? That's a luxury. Most peasants made do with wood, bone, or hand-me-downs, rusted so badly they look more like cursed relics than anything useful. His spade is a rough wedge tied with sinew. The handle splinters when he grips it. He'll still use it. What choice does he have? Meanwhile, Mayreed has already started beating the wool against a flat stone. Fulling the cloth, they call it. But really, it's just her taking out centuries of generational exhaustion on a pile of soggy sheep hair. The stream runs cold nearby, which is perfect for numbing her hands until they stop working altogether. Gloves? That's what your calluses are for. Every movement in this life is utilitarian. There is no exercise, no self-care. Your body is both tool and currency. If you can't move, you don't eat. If you can't carry water, you become the burden. And unlike modern society, there's no pity for the weak. Aodan remembers his uncle Seamus fell from a donkey, shattered his hip, and spent the next 6 years crawling around the hut like a broken table. Nobody asked if he needed help. He was given chores. Even children here aren't spared. His eldest, Donal, is 5 and already hauling kindling. He'll grow up fast, if he grows up at all. Back at the fire, the smoke is building again. Peat, their only fuel, burns dirty. It fills the room with a bitter fog that blackens the ceiling and lungs alike. There's no chimney, just a hole where birds sometimes fall in. The children cough more in winter. Everyone does. The medieval flu isn't so much a seasonal thing as it is a constant companion. There's no word for asthma, just the wheeze. If you collapse, people say you had the bad air, then they move on, and yet they smile. It's strange, isn't it? The children still laugh. They run barefoot over stones, scream when the goats chase them, and sing songs older than the hills. Mayreed hums a tune her mother taught her, one her grandmother sang too. Songs here carry more than melody. They carry memory. They are lullabies and legal records, curses and love letters. And sometimes the only inheritance you get. In the distance, bells ring from a tiny stone monastery perched on a slope. The monks will get up soon too, but unlike Aodan, they won't be chasing pigs or worrying about a dying cow. They'll be transcribing the word of God with duck feather quills and pondering the meaning of sin while their sheep graze freely on donated land. It's good to be holy in Ireland, especially when other people are doing the farming. Aodan occasionally trudges to the monastery, not for salvation but for salt. That, or the hope of trading a basket of eggs for something more exotic, like dried fish or wax. Sometimes he leaves with just a blessing, which is nice, but doesn't fix the hole in his roof, or the hunger in his stomach. Let's pause again. We love the word self-sufficiency today. Makes it sound noble, right? Off the grid, organic, anti-capitalist. But in medieval Ireland, self-sufficiency meant you were on your own. If your crops failed, too bad. If your cow gave birth to a dead calf, too bad. If a storm wiped out your thatch roof, too bad. You don't get bailouts. You don't get sympathy. You get the privilege of continuing to survive. Barely. Mayor Reed tends the small garden behind the hut. It's mostly herbs, nettle, sorrel, wild garlic, anything that doesn't mind drowning twice a week. She's drying some mushrooms too, and not the fun kind. No one here is microdosing to manage stress. They're macrodosing because that's dinner. Sometimes they find the wrong kind and hallucinate through the night, puking into the fire pit while praying to St. Bridget and swearing off foraging forever. Until next week. The mid-morning meal is as humble as it sounds. Cold gruel and, if you're lucky, a bit of cheese or stale bread hard enough to file a tooth. Aodan gnaws on it anyway. The satisfaction isn't in the taste, it's in not being hungry for 2 whole hours. Small victories. Later, he'll go check the trap lines. Rabbits, if God is kind. Weasels, if not. Either way, it's meat. And in a land with no proper preservation, meat is a seasonal miracle. Mostly, they subsist on grains. But famine is always one wet week away. That's the great joke of Ireland, land of green, yet you starve in it. His neighbour, Aogan, trudges by with a sack over his shoulder. They nod. No time for chatter. They'll speak later, maybe over a cup of boiled milk, while mending baskets. Gossip is the glue of this community. Who's hoarding barley? Whose goat wandered into the priest's garden? Who might be a changeling? Everyone has a theory. Everyone has a secret. By midday, the sun finally cuts through the mist, revealing everything in cruel clarity. The children are muddy. The hens escaped again, and Aodan's toenail is definitely infected. But there's no time for drama. The world keeps spinning. And if you want to stay on it, you don't stop moving. Let's be clear. This life wasn't beautiful. It wasn't noble. It wasn't poetic. It was painful, repetitive, and thankless. But it was also real. More real than any romanticized storybook nonsense about Celtic serenity. The people here laughed, fought, cursed, and died with mud on their hands and smoke in their lungs. They were not heroes. They were survivors. And tomorrow, it begins again. Same bog, same barley, same barely hanging on hope. Chapter 2. A belly full of porridge and fear. The breakfast struggle. If you thought mornings in medieval Ireland were harsh, wait until you sit down for breakfast, assuming you get one. The fantasy is tempting. A warm hearth, a bubbling pot, family gathered around a wooden table, singing old Gaelic songs. The reality? An acrid-smelling hut, a cracked clay bowl of thin gruel, and a silent prayer that today's meal doesn't taste like the foot rot growing in the corner. Aodan, our crusty, sleep-deprived farmer, doesn't even fully sit to eat. His back is sore from yesterday's ditching work. He just leans against a wobbly wooden stool and slurps cold barley mush from a bowl he carved himself years ago from what may have been driftwood or possibly part of a shipwreck he never checked. It's chipped now, but still holds food better than his teeth. Breakfast isn't a meal here, it's a negotiation. You negotiate with your pantry, with the weather, with the rats that may or may not have nibbled on your grain sack last night. If you win the negotiation, you get a ladle of something edible. If you lose, you chew on a sour apple and hope your stomach doesn't report you to your ribs for neglect. Today, Mayreed managed to boil down a bit of barley with goat milk and some bitter herbs. It tastes like something between spoiled yogurt and sawdust, but it's warm. Warm is good. Warm means not dying. The kids crowd around, each with their own sloppily carved spoons. The youngest tries to eat with his hands. No one corrects him. When you're hungry, etiquette is for nobles and monks. They eat in silence. Not because of reverence, but because talking takes energy, and they'd rather keep that energy stored for when the goats try to escape or the chickens disappear into the woods again. Also, you don't waste breath when food might trigger coughing. The smoke from the peat fire has been extra thick this week. Something about the turf being too wet, or cursed, or both. Mayreed suspects Bridget next door cursed the stack after their last butter trading spat. And here lies the central crisis of breakfast in medieval Ireland. You're always hungry and you're always suspicious. Suspicious of your neighbour. Suspicious of the milk. Suspicious of the greenish bread that smells faintly like death and possibly mould. But you eat it anyway. Hunger is the great equaliser. It humbles every stomach, noble or not. Now let's get academic for a moment. What did they really eat? Mostly grain-based porridge, barley, oats, maybe spelt if you were lucky. Add goat's milk or water, maybe a handful of bitter greens. In good years, they might bake flatbread on hot stones, a crusty, teeth-shattering thing that made you appreciate your molars. Honey was rare and precious, mostly reserved for the wealthy or stolen from hives by desperate teenagers with more courage than sense. Eggs were a treat. Meat? Practically a myth for the average peasant. You didn't eat your livestock, you depended on it. Killing a cow was like emptying your bank account and lighting it on fire. Famine? Oh, famine was a seasonal guest. If spring rains came too early, or too late, or too hard, you could lose everything. A bad oat crop meant months of misery. Too much mildew on your rye, and suddenly the whole village was hallucinating from ergot poisoning, a fungal toxin so terrifying it made people convulse, scream, and see demons. Historians now believe many possessions and witchcraft cases were just hungry farmers tripping on spoiled bread. But hey, that's medieval organic for you. Back in Aodan's hut, the gruel is gone. The children are licking their spoons like dogs. Mayreed is already rinsing the pot in cold water with a fistful of grass and gravel. Soap? Never heard of her. Clean enough as the standard, and the only bacteria they feared were the ones that made things smell too foul to eat. If it didn't stink that bad, you shrugged and swallowed. Meanwhile, the rats in the corner are getting bolder. They know when breakfast ends, there's always a few dropped oats or a sticky spoon to lick. Mayreed chases them off with a broom so splintered it might as well be another rat. Aodan considers making a trap, but he'd have to sacrifice rope, and rope is needed to tie the goat's leg, which keeps swelling for reasons no one understands. Probably a fairy curse. Maybe gout. Maybe both. The goat watches this entire scene with a kind of smug contempt. She's the queen of the household. Her milk fuels their meals, her dung heats their floor, and her mood determines the children's bruises. No one messes with the goat. The sun now slices through a crack in the wall, illuminating the hut in a thin golden beam that makes the dirt shimmer. For a moment, it looks almost peaceful, beautiful even, until someone sneezes and the whole family erupts into a coughing fit so violent it sounds like a chorus of dying bagpipes. Aodan steps outside again. He's still hungry. He's always hungry. He scratches at the dry patch on his arm and considers chewing a handful of sour dock leaves. He remembers his cousin, who once ate unripe berries out of desperation and ended up vomiting in a ditch for 3 days. They buried him on the 4th. Still, he smiles, because even in this bleak existence, the Irish have always had humour, a wry, sharp thing like a blade made of peat. Aodan once joked that famine was the only consistent visitor in their lives. His wife didn't laugh. His neighbour did. That was enough. Now comes the final act of this sad little breakfast play, clean-up. Mayor Reed throws the dishwater outside, careful not to splash the door lintel. Superstition again. You don't want to offend the house spirits, or attract the attention of wandering banshees. Yes, banshees. Crying spirits believed to herald death. Honestly, they're the least of your worries, but try telling that to a sleep-deprived mother with 3 sick children. The goat bleats. Time to start the rest of the day. Aodan adjusts the rope on his belt, picks up his stone hoe, and trudges back toward the field, a generous word for the uneven patch of mud behind the hut. He's still thinking about food. He always will be. Because in medieval Ireland, the only thing harder than finding food was forgetting how hungry you were. The smell of scorched oats still lingers in the air. It clings to the walls, to the thatch, to Aodan's wool tunic that hasn't been properly washed in over a month. Not because he's lazy, but because doing laundry in medieval Ireland meant breaking ice on a stream, beating cloth on rocks, and hoping the fairies didn't curse your undergarments for disrespecting the river spirits. If you've never worn damp wool for 5 days in a row, you've never truly suffered. With breakfast cleared away, meaning scraped clean enough to reuse without attracting too many flies. Mayreed moves to the day's next priority, preparing the next meal before the last one has even finished digesting. Meal might be a generous term. Calorie acquisition event might be more honest. There's a sack of dried peas they've been rationing since the last festival. A festival, for the record, where the highlight was watching 2 men wrestle for a stale apple. The peas are hard as rocks, speckled with tiny holes. Mayreed suspects weevils. She pretends not to notice. In this world, you don't get to be picky. If you threw out everything with bugs, you'd starve. So into the cauldron they go. The pot, blackened from years of fire and soot, is suspended over the hearth by a rusting iron hook passed down from her grandmother, who claimed it came from a Viking shipwreck. That may or may not be true. In Ireland, everything old is either Viking or cursed. Sometimes both. But it still holds heat, so it's worth more than gold. Mayreed adds a few handfuls of chopped nettle and wild garlic. Flavour, sort of. Nettles sting your fingers, but she's developed calluses thick enough to grip thorns without flinching. Garlic masks rot. And if something tastes off, you stir faster and pray to Saint Ciaran that it was just a trick of the tongue, not botulism setting in. Let's talk about food safety. Because in medieval Ireland, it didn't exist. No refrigeration, no preservation beyond smoke, salt if you could get it, or sheer optimism. Meat was smoked over peat fires until it resembled edible wood. Milk was consumed immediately or turned into curds, cheese or butter. If it soured, that just meant it had character. Fermentation wasn't a culinary art. It was what happened when you left your dinner out too long and hoped for the best. And yet, there was creativity. The Irish were masters of making nothing into something. Bob butter real thing? Was butter buried in the ground in airtight containers to preserve it? Archaeologists have dug up 1,000-year-old barrels of the stuff, still technically edible. That's right, Irish butter is so stubborn, it outlives empires. Of course, this ingenuity came from desperation, not luxury. They didn't invent oat cakes, soda bread, or griddle cakes because they were foodies. They made them because they had oats, ashes, and desperation. Most of these meals could be cooked over a stone, a flame, or in the palm of your hand if you were desperate enough. Aodan returns from the field empty-handed. No game in the traps. The birds were smarter today, or hungrier. Either way, the stew will remain vegetarian again. He peeks into the pot and doesn't say a word. There's a silent pact between him and Mayreed. Don't criticise the stew. Not unless you want to be sleeping next to the goat tonight. Again. He instead goes to fetch water. The well is 2 minutes away, across a soggy trail where the ground squelches underfoot like walking on wet bread. The bucket is made of staves and bound with twine. It leaks slightly, but again, good enough. The water is cold, clearish, and filled with just enough mystery to be exciting. Aodan once found a frog in the pail. He considered cooking it. then remembered a neighbour who did the same and went blind 2 days later. Coincidence? Maybe. But better to drink the water and leave the frogs alone. Once home, the water's added to the pot to stretch the stew. Mareade stirs with a stick that doubles as a cane and a weapon. The fire hisses. A cough erupts from the children. Again. Always. The peat smoke never truly clears. It's a flavour and an atmosphere. A seasoning and a disease. And now, the bread. Mayreed needs a small round of dough, barley and ground acorns with a pinch of salt. No yeast. Just ash and instinct. She flattens it and presses it onto the hot stones by the half. No oven, no timer, no precision. When it smells slightly burnt but not on fire, it's ready. Lunch, such as it is, will consist of stew that tastes like a bog and bread that crunches like gravel, but it fills the belly. It tells the body to keep going. And really, that's all food was, fuel. No one here eats for pleasure. They eat because their bodies are disintegrating and need mortar. Children eat first. The littlest is teething. He gnaws on a stale crust until his gums bleed. Mareade wipes the blood with a rag dipped in goat milk and mutters a prayer. Iodine waits. He takes the burnt side of the bread. Always does. Not because he's noble, but because that's what men do here. Eat last, work first, and die somewhere in between. You may wonder, what about variety? Surely they foraged. They did. Hazelnuts, mushrooms, berries, even seaweed if you live near the coast. But foraging was risk and ritual. You had to know what to pick, where to pick, and when not to touch. Eat the wrong berry, and your family might watch you foam at the mouth and twitch for hours. And again, nobody's calling an ambulance. You get a blessing, a wet cloth, and a hole in the ground. And when famine hit, and it did, people ate bark, boiled grass, dead pets. The Irish weather was not your friend. A few days of hard rain could wash away your livelihood. Then you'd trade for food. If you had nothing to trade, you begged. If no one had extra, you died. But let's be fair. It wasn't all grim. On rare good years, the harvest was kind. You'd get wheat, pulses, honey from lucky hives, even beer made from fermented barley and herbs. They brewed weak ale for hydration because water alone was unreliable. Kids drank it too. No one worried about underage drinking when the average lifespan was 40 and the milk might kill you. Today, the stew is edible. Barely. They eat in silence again. Not because they're unhappy, but because eating is sacred in a way. It's a moment of stillness, a temporary victory over death. Every swallow is a declaration, I'm not done yet. And when the bowls are scraped clean and the pot set back on its hook, Iodine and Mayreed lock eyes. They don't speak, they don't need to, the message is clear, we did it again. One more meal down, one more day to face. Chapter 3. Mud for walls, smoke for ceilings. Inside the medieval Irish home, you could smell a medieval Irish house before you saw it. Not because people were particularly filthy, though, let's be honest, they were. But because the building itself seemed to sweat decades of smoke, mould, wet wool, cow dung, and human fatigue. It wasn't just a dwelling. It was a living, wheezing organism, stitched together with moss, regret, and blind optimism. And if you were lucky enough to own one, congratulations. You'd made it onto the lowest rung of survivable existence. Iodine's house was no exception. It sat lopsided on a patch of land that could hardly be called dry, surrounded by a low stone wall to keep out dogs, wolves, and worse neighbours. The walls of the home were made from wattle and daub, woven sticks smeared with a delightful paste of mud, straw, manure, and whatever else happened to be sticky that day. It wasn't art. It was function. And sometimes, if the rain came sideways, it functioned as a sieve. The roof, thatched of course, thick bundles of straw layered in desperate hopes of repelling Ireland's unrelenting rain. Except they rarely worked as intended. A properly thatched roof might last a decade. Iodine's was on year 12 and looked like it had fought a war and lost. Birds lived in the rafters, mice lived in the walls. Spiders ruled everything in between. The house was one room, one. No bedrooms, no kitchen, no privacy. just a singular, windowless cube of suffocating closeness, where humans, animals, smoke, and sound all crashed together like the world's least charming inn. In winter, they brought the cows inside. Not for fun, but for warmth. A cow's body heat could mean the difference between frostbite and just being very, very miserable. Of course, the side effect was that your house now smelled like a cow's digestive system in stereo. At the centre of this chaos sat the hearth, a sunken fire pit, not enclosed, not vented, just open flame licking at soot-darkened air. Above it, the smoke had nowhere to go but up into the thatch, where it accumulated like a slow, smothering fog. The ceiling wasn't blackened, it was charred. Every breath in the house carried a faint taste of fire. Every shirt, every strand of hair, every bite of food bore the scent of smoke so thick it felt like a second skin. There were no chimneys. Chimneys were for monasteries and castles. Commoners had a hole in the roof, and if the wind was kind, some smoke left that way. Most didn't. The children developed the morning cough by age 4. Mary once joked that the fire didn't just cook the stew, it cooked the lungs too. No one laughed. Let's talk furnishings. There was no furniture in the modern sense. A table was a plank balanced on 2 crates. Chairs were flat rocks or tree stumps. Beds were straw mats laid directly on the dirt floor, sometimes raised on stones if you were feeling fancy. Blankets were old cloaks, woven wool or animal skins, all of which smelled like the past 10 years. The only soft thing in the house was a bundle of feathers. Iodon's grandmother claimed came from a swan. Everyone knew it was just geese. Nobody corrected her. The walls bore a few tools, a rusty dagger, a wooden rosary, and a crude wooden carving of a saint who looked suspiciously like someone's uncle. Religion wasn't just a belief. It was decoration, security, and insurance all at once. You didn't go to bed without nodding to the cross. You didn't hang meat without a blessing. You didn't birth a child without chalking symbols over the door to keep away spirits. The house itself was sacred and fragile. One wrong breath could invite disaster. Despite the cramped space, everything had its place. The cooking pot had a corner. So did the milk churn, the spinning wheel, the seed sacks, and the various sticks used for prodding, stirring, and occasionally disciplining. Children slept closest to the wall, tucked between the straw and stones. Aodan and Myreed had a slightly more central spot, partly for warmth, partly for protection. If wolves came scratching, they'd be the first to wake, or be eaten. Now hygiene. Brace yourself. There was no soap, maybe a lump of lye-based sludge from last season's ashes, but it stung and reeked. Washing happened in rivers. Occasionally. In summer. Maybe. And usually only if something began to crawl on your body that wasn't supposed to be there. Clothes were beaten clean with rocks. Bodies were left to fend for themselves. Perfume? A medieval Irishman's scent was a potent cocktail of sweat, peat, sour milk, and damp wool. You couldn't bottle it, but you could definitely gag on it. Toilet arrangements? A trench. Out back. In the wet. Covered with rushes if you were lucky. No one sat. You squatted, swatted flies, and prayed the wind didn't change. If you were too old or too young to make it outside, there was a corner bucket, which was emptied. Sometimes. But let's not pretend these people didn't care. They did. Mayreed swept the floor with a bunch of stiff reeds tied together. She aired out the linens on rare dry days, and even tried herbal infusions to freshen the air. Lavender wasn't common, but mugwort worked well enough. And burning dried dung, while offensive, did keep the fleas down. Sort of, maybe, on good days. Despite everything, the home was a sanctuary. It was protection against wind, rain, beasts, and curses. It was the warmest place in a cold world. The place where children were born, stories were told, and the past was remembered. Songs were sung here. Bread was broken here. Even in its smoke-choked, mud-slicked state, it meant something. But don't romanticize it. Don't imagine a cozy cottage with a crackling fire and giggling children. Imagine wheezing. Imagine lice. Imagine stepping on a sharp bone in the dark while trying not to crush the baby sleeping next to the goat. That's home. And the irony? This was considered a good home. The truly poor didn't even have walls. They huddled in lean-tos, under overhangs, or simply dug out spots in the hillsides. Aodan, for all his troubles, was blessed, or so he told himself, especially when the rain didn't come through the roof. Tonight, as he watches the fire dwindle, the children curled like puppies at his side, Mayreed spinning wool with cracked fingers, and a spider building a kingdom in the rafter above him, he lets out a long breath. The house groans with wind. The smoke presses down like a heavy wool blanket. And still, this is safety, this is survival, this is home. When the sun dipped below the mossy hills, and the damp chill slithered through the cracks of every stone wall, the medieval Irish home transformed from a noisy worksite into a cramped cocoon of tension, superstition, and exhausted silence. Inside Aodan's hut, the fire was stoked one last time, more smoke than flame, and the family prepared to settle in for another sleepless night in the humid, airless dark. There was no such thing as winding down. There was only choosing a corner where your ribs didn't ache too badly against the packed dirt. Everyone slept in the same room, and the room was everything. Bedroom, kitchen, nursery, animal stall, pantry, and, when the time came, sick ward and deathbed. It smelled like all those things too. There was no division of space beyond what you imagined in your head. The goat slept near the door, the cow near the fire, the children near the cow, and Aodan and Mayreed somewhere between practicality and discomfort. If a child rolled the wrong way, they'd find a hoof. If you sneezed too hard, you might blow ash into someone's face or knock over a clay bowl from a shelf barely hanging by a rope and a prayer. There was no such thing as privacy. None. You heard everything. Every cough. Every shift under a scratchy wool blanket. Every whispered prayer. Every argument, no matter how soft. If a couple tried to have an intimate moment, it had to be choreographed around the rhythm of sleeping children, weather noises, and the faint hope that the neighbours weren't also listening through the stone wall. And yes, in many hamlets, homes shared walls, or were so close that a burp carried like a bard's ballad. But the emotional strain wasn't spoken of. You didn't say, "I need space." You didn't dream of a separate room. You endured. You layered resentment with resignation and found comfort where you could, perhaps, in a single moment of eye contact during stew, or when the baby finally stopped crying. Even children weren't spared. They weren't babied. They were smaller adults expected to contribute, obey, and survive. Discipline came in the form of words, hands, or the flat end of a cooking stick. Mayreed had never once considered it cruel. It was correction. You hit because you loved them, or because you were terrified they might step into a fire pit, or run toward a suspicious knock on the door and end up in a rival clan's ransom note. The world didn't coddle children, so neither did their parents, and yet somehow there was affection. It was just buried under layers of soot and fatigue. When one child woke with night sweats, Mayreed scooped in close without a word. When the oldest scraped his knee on a rusted nail, Aodan chewed a wad of dandelion root and pressed it to the wound, muttering a prayer to St. Columba. They weren't expressive, but they were present. And in this world, that counted for everything. The real power in the home wasn't the man or even the fire. It was fear. Fear of spirits, curses, and things unseen. This house, for all its flaws, was a spiritual battleground. Mayreed had talismans hanging by the lintel crosses made of rushes, tiny dolls of straw, and carved bones dipped in ash. She knew every creak and crack of the building and what it meant. 3 taps at night, bad luck. Whispers in the corner, a fairy passing through, a cold breeze on a windless night, a soul leaving or entering. These beliefs weren't optional, they were armour. When you lived in a one-room box where illness could sweep through in a day and fever dreams often turned into funerals, you needed to believe that something, anything, could explain the madness. That the wet floor wasn't just bad luck, but a punishment for disrespecting the hearth. That the spoiled milk wasn't bacteria, but Bridget's revenge for missing Mass. It gave people a sense of control, however false. Because the truth that death and decay were constant, random, and uncaring was far more terrifying. Superstition even governed cleaning. Sweeping after sunset was said to invite poverty. Leaving a broom upright could anger house spirits. Spitting in the corner before bed kept the banshees at bay. And don't even mention yawning without covering your mouth. Everyone knew that left your soul vulnerable to possession. The home wasn't just shelter. It was a living spiritual trap with rules, rituals, and routines. Break them, and you weren't just risking discomfort. You were opening the door to calamity. Aodan didn't believe all of it, but he believed enough. Enough to nod respectfully at the carved saint on the wall each night. Enough to check the rafters for signs of owls, which foretold death. Enough to whisper a thank you to the fire before he lay down. Because in this world, you didn't have faith, you bargained with it, every single night. And night was the worst time. With the fire dwindling and only the faint orange glow lighting the room, every noise took on a new shape. The wind became voices. The rafters creaked like footsteps. The goat snored like a dying man. And in the darkness, the air thick with peat smoke and worry, everyone pretended to sleep. No one truly did. You laid still, listening for danger, hoping not to hear it. Merad thought about the hole in the roof. It had grown wider this month. Rain would come. They had no straw to patch it. She'd have to trade something. But what? The child's cloak? A pot lid? Her last bar of beeswax. Maybe she could visit the Hedge witch. Ask for a spell to hold off the rain. Though that could backfire. Magic always costs something. Aodan stared at the ceiling. He didn't think of tomorrow. Farmers in Ireland rarely did. You thought only one step ahead. Fix the fence. Watch the cow. Pray the barley didn't rot in the field again. Anything beyond that was foolishness, and yet somehow the house held. It held its shape through storms, raids, sickness and sorrow. It was smoke-stained, lopsided, barely habitable, but it endured, much like the people inside it. And though no one spoke it aloud, there was a pride in that. You could say what you wanted about the poverty, the mud, the stench, but it was theirs. As the fire died entirely and the hut was swallowed by damp silence, one of the children mumbled in his sleep. Merad reached over and pulled him close. Aodan turned onto his side, one hand on the hilt of his dull knife, just in case. Outside the wind howled. Inside the home breathed its creaking, smoky breath. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 4. Cattle over Children. Wealth, raids, and the true currency of Ireland. In medieval Ireland, gold didn't make you rich. Coins meant nothing in the bog. Land helped, sure, but only if it came with hooves. Because the real wealth, the real power, the real status in every damp village and windswept hill was cattle. Not grain, not jewels, not titles. Cows. Loud, smelly, unpredictable cows. And they weren't just a food source, they were everything. Bank account, dowry, dinner, dispute, and disaster, all rolled into one bellowing, farting package. Aodan owned 3. That put him slightly above starving, slightly below comfortable, and perpetually anxious. Because every day those cows stood upright was a small economic miracle. And every time they didn't, the entire household hovered one breath closer to ruin. It's hard to overstate this. In 13th century Ireland, cows were literally the unit of measurement for value. The word bow in Old Irish meant cow, and had formed the root for boer, meaning landholder or freeman. Your social status was calculated not by how many rooms your hut had, none, or how many spoons you owned, also none, but by how many cattle you could count, and, more importantly, keep from being stolen. The law even reflected it. Brehon law, the complex web of native Irish justice, assigned penalties and rewards in cows. You insulted someone's honour? 2 cows. You broke their leg? 5 cows. You murdered someone? 7 cows and a feast for the kin, if you wanted to avoid a blood feud. Cows were everything. If a man offered 10 cows for your daughter, you didn't feel insulted. You felt flattered. Children were raised in part to help tend cattle. Sometimes they were even exchanged like cattle. The distinctions blurred. And so, Aeodon's morning began as always, not with prayer, not with stretching, but with counting. 1, 2, 3, still there, still breathing, no missing tails. No hoofprints in the mud heading in the wrong direction. The cow with the limp was still limping, which meant she was at least alive. He exhaled. Another night without rustlers. A small win. Because cattle raids were a sport, a tradition, practically an art form. One clan sneaks in under cover of darkness, grabs a few prize beasts, and vanishes over the hills. A week later, the victim clan retaliates. Maybe they steal their cows back. Maybe they take different ones. Maybe someone gets stabbed. Maybe everyone just drinks afterward and calls it even. Justice by bovine. These weren't lawless acts. In fact, they were often sanctioned by custom. Aeodon's uncle had once led a raid with ceremonial paint on his face, singing a war chant older than the parish church. He came back with 2 cows and a broken toe, and they celebrated for 3 days. One of those cows later choked to death on a rope. Still, it had been worth it. Even the spiritual world bowed to the cow. Certain festivals like Beltane, marking the beginning of summer, centered around driving cattle between 2 fires for blessing and protection. Cows were sacred. Their health reflected your household's fate. A sick cow meant bad omens. A calf born deformed was a warning. A cow that gave sour milk might prompt a visit to the local wise woman for a curse removal, or an accusation that your neighbour had overlooked your pasture with the evil eye. Mary never looked another woman's cow directly in the eye. She knew better. Maintaining cattle was no easy task. There were no fences, just rough stone walls and crude hurdles. Cows wandered. They trampled crops. They picked fights with pigs. One particularly aggressive bull in a nearby hamlet had maimed 3 men and impregnated half the herd before being dubbed a minor deity and given his own name day. Feeding them was another challenge. Grass was everywhere, but not all of it was safe. Wet ground meant foot rot. Too much rain could rot the fodder. And storing hay was nearly impossible in the sodden climate. Most families fed their cows day by day, hoping each patch of ground held just enough dry forage. When winter came, and the grass shrank back into the earth like a frightened worm, you resorted to boiled leaves, root mash, and, on very bad days, chewed bark. The cows hated it. But they ate. If they didn't, you lost your savings overnight. Aeodon remembered the time one of his cows bloated and died. They had tried everything: charms, herbal infusions, prayers, bleeding. But it was no use. It was a slow, gurgling death. They buried her behind the hut, not for sanitation, but to keep scavengers and curious neighbours from sniffing around. The ground never grew right afterward. The priest said the land was disturbed. Myriad said it was just the worms. That night they had a meat feast. Morally ambiguous? Yes. Economically stupid? Also yes. But hunger makes theologians out of all of us. Cattle were also security. If your family was accused of theft, cowardice, or worse, like consorting with foreigners, you could buy your way back into favour with cattle. 1 cow might smooth over a heated insult. 2 might patch a bloodline rift. 3 meant forgiveness. 4 meant you were marrying someone. If you had 5 cows, you were someone. And so, Aeodon's day revolved around them. He scrubbed their hooves with twigs. He checked their dung for signs of sickness. He milked them gently, murmuring old rhymes passed down from his mother. And he stared across the field at the neighbouring herd, wondering which one might vanish in a well-executed midnight adventure. Not that he was planning anything, but he also kept a rope ready, just in case. Children learned early that the cows ate before they did. If there was extra milk, they got some. If there wasn't, they didn't. There was no debate. Even the smallest child could recite the unspoken rule: the cows come first. This wasn't cruelty, it was survival. Without cows, there was no milk, no trade, no manure for the garden, no meat for the winter, no bride price, no status, and no future. Without cows, you weren't just poor, you were invisible. Aodon may have had ragged clothes and blistered hands, but when he walked through the village with 3 cows behind him, heads turned, people nodded. He wasn't rich, but he mattered. And in a world as brutal and brief as his, that was more than most could hope for. By afternoon, Aodon was down in the pasture again, keeping one eye on the cows and the other on the tree line. Not because he expected wolves, those were rare this far inland, but because he expected men. Specifically, neighbours with nothing to lose and everything to gain. Cattle theft wasn't just a crime. It was a tradition. A brutal, fast-paced, semi-respectable hobby that sat somewhere between economic stimulus and neighbourhood insult. And if your cow went missing, you didn't weep. You armed yourself. This is where Brehon law stepped in. Or, rather, stumbled. It was less of a legal code and more of a tangled, poetic mess of customs, compensations and cows. Written down by monks but based on oral tradition, Brehon law didn't deal in jails or hard justice. It dealt in balance. You break something, you owe something, usually a cow. Or 2. Or 10, depending on the damage and your social rank. Mayreed once told Aodon about a woman in another Tuath who lost a tooth in a scuffle. The man who knocked it out had to pay 1 cow per molar, plus an extra for insult. She joked that if she ever needed a new roof, she'd pick a fight near a stone wall and smile through the bruises. He didn't laugh. It was too real. Under Brehon law, even the most intimate aspects of life had a bovine value. Theft, injury, adultery, slander, each one had a precise price. You didn't go to court. You went to the Brehon, a respected legal figure, with a memory like an ox and the moral flexibility of a tired priest. He'd hear the facts, consult his verse-laced scrolls, and announce a ruling that sounded more like a riddle than a sentence. You shall pay 3 full cows and 1 half calf, for the insult was sharp, but the injury mild, he might declare, tapping his staff on the ground. And just like that the matter was settled. No appeals, no written forms, just cows. Justice was poetic, until you ran out of livestock. Aodon had once found himself on the wrong end of this system, when his neighbour Eogan claimed one of Aodon's cows had broken into his oat patch. There were hoofprints, yes, but they could have belonged to anyone's cow. Still, the Brehon decided Aodon owed Eohan a heifer, not the old one either, a good one. He tried to protest, but tradition is louder than logic. He handed over the cow the next day, his jaw clenched so hard he could have cracked walnut shells with his teeth. Eogan was polite about it, which somehow made it worse. The thing about cattle law was that it wasn't always fair, it was just ancient, and that made it sacred. You couldn't argue with a system your grandfather's bones were buried under. The very land seemed to echo its approval. Even when you knew it was nonsense. Children learned to count not with numbers but with value. How many cows is that worth, they'd ask, when something broke, when someone cried, when someone kissed someone else's betrothed. It was a way of thinking, a worldview where everything had weight in hide and horn. Dowries were measured in cows. Marriages negotiated with cattle exchanges that felt more like hostage deals. Aodon's own wedding involved 2 cows and a bag of barley. Mayreed's father had insisted on the cows. The barley was a bonus. She never let him forget that he'd been priced like a young bull. Even religion bent to bovine pressure. Donations to the church came in milk and calves. Priests blessed cattle with water and smoke. The holy and the herd-bound were deeply entwined. After all, who needed a golden chalice when you had a cow that produced 5 pints a day? But the danger came from mobility. You couldn't bury cows in chests or lock them behind doors. They wandered. They lowed. They attracted attention. And they were tempting targets in a world where poverty was constant and opportunity was hoofed. At night, farmers took turns sleeping by the pen. Aodon had a spear blunt from rust, but sharp enough to discourage drunk teens on a dare. Mayreed hung small charms above the cows' feeding troughs, twisted straw crosses, stones with holes, the feather of a blackbird. Protection, she said. Whether from men or magic she never specified. There were whispered tales of cattle vanishing without a trace. No prints, no sound, just gone. Some blamed witches, others fae folk. Aodon blamed hunger. Desperate men did desperate things. He didn't need fairy tales, he needed stronger fences. And what if someone stole your cow and denied it? You could challenge them to a truth test. A bizarre ritual involving oaths, fasting, and sometimes holding a hot iron to prove innocence. It rarely ended well. Most people just paid a Brehon to mediate and hoped the ruling didn't bankrupt them. The real tragedy was this: people were worth less than animals. A child could be lost, and the community mourned. A cow could be stolen, and a war might start. Because cows fed families, fertilized fields, and fueled futures. Children, they grew up sure, but they cost food first. A harsh truth, unspoken but understood. Mareed had once buried a baby illness, winter, nothing they could stop. She cried silently for 3 nights, but when one of their cows limped from hoof rot, she wept openly, calling on saints and saints' mothers, offering up prayers and cloth and salt, not because she loved the cow more, but because they needed the cow more. One death was personal, the other was survival. This wasn't cold-heartedness, it was hierarchy. Life had to be organised, and in medieval Ireland, cows outranked almost everything. The stone churches, the hill forts, the songs, they all existed on the backs of cattle. Aodon sometimes wondered what it would be like to live in a world where worth wasn't measured in udders, where value came from thought, or song, or skill with words. But then he remembered his own hunger, and the weight of his children's ribs under their shirts. Dreams were nice, but you couldn't milk them, so he continued. Day after day, watching the herd, counting again, 1, 2, 3, still there, still alive, still wealthy, by the only standard that mattered. Chapter 5. Curse of the Brehon Laws. Justice for the privileged. If you were a poor farmer in medieval Ireland and thought the law would protect you, it was probably because you'd taken a rock to the head and lost your sense of reality. Justice in Aodon's world didn't come from balance, fairness, or truth. It came from cows, charm, and the sheer weight of who your uncle knew. Brehon law, that ancient system of rights and restitution, was less a legal code and more a poem with an agenda. It sounded beautiful when recited by a monk with a harp. It sounded a lot less beautiful when you were bleeding from the mouth and being told your injury was worth half a goat. The Brehons, the judges, weren't kings, nor were they priests. They were men, and occasionally women, of words, law, and long memories. In theory, they were neutral. In practice, they were loyal to the local lords, the landowners, or whoever provided the best hospitality. Yes, in Brehon Island, legal neutrality could be heavily influenced by meat pies and generous portions of mead. If the man who broke your arm hosted the Brehon for a 3-day feast last summer, you might as well kiss justice goodbye and start preparing your apology. The laws themselves were ancient, bizarre, and so specific they sometimes bordered on the comical. There were fines for everything. Did your sheep wander into someone's barley? Pay 3 measures of seed. Did you insult a man by calling him cowballed in front of his kin? That's a defamation case. He can claim your best cloak. Did your dog bite his pig? Split the cost of the damage unless the pig started it, in which case the pig's owner owes you milk. This wasn't a joke. These were real legal proceedings, often written in verse, debated over clay cups of sour ale. Aodon had been summoned once for insulting a local craftsman. He'd muttered that the man's baskets were so full of holes, even the fairies wouldn't steal them. Word got back to the Brehon. Aodon had to offer 1 sheep and 2 public compliments to settle the matter. The compliments were the hard part. But these laws didn't touch everyone equally. The higher your status, the higher your honour price. The legal value of your dignity. A nobleman's insult could cost 10 cows. A freeman's, maybe 1. A serf's, nothing. Which meant that if someone above you struck you, your options were to take it, bribe the Brehon, or retaliate and pray your clan backed you. The law wasn't blind, it just preferred not to look too hard at anyone below the social moss line. Women, technically, had protections under Brehon law, rights to property, marriage negotiation and even divorce. But only in theory. In reality, a woman's ability to wield the law depended on her family's influence. Mary had once advised a girl who was beaten by her husband to seek legal recourse. The Brehon listened, nodded, quoted some ancient verse about unity, and suggested she return home and try not to provoke him. That girl later vanished. Some said she joined a convent. Others whispered she became a crow. And as for punishment, forget dungeons or executions. Medieval Irish justice was all about payment, not punishment. You paid for wounds, insults, theft, even infidelity. If you couldn't pay, your kin paid. If they refused, you were ostracized, cut off, isolated, untouchable. Worse than death in a society where community meant survival. This system of compensation meant that the rich could get away with almost anything. They could pay off injuries, pay off dishonour, pay off death itself. Aodon had watched a chieftain's son break a man's nose during a drunken argument. The man got 3 cows in return and was expected to be grateful. He was. He used the cows to marry his daughter off. That's how things worked. Pain became property. Grief became barter. And then there were the ordeals. If evidence failed, or if someone accused you of lying under oath, you could be forced into a truth test. These were less about logic and more about spectacle. One common method involved carrying a red-hot iron bar across your hands. If your burns healed cleanly in 3 days, you were innocent. If they festered, guilty. In short, God was the jury, and infection was his verdict. Aodon had seen this once. A tanner was accused of stealing a necklace from the wife of a local lord. No one could prove it. So, the Brehon ordered a truth test. The man lifted the iron. His screams haunted the village for days. The wounds turned black. He lost 3 fingers. They said he deserved it. Whether he actually stole the necklace was never confirmed. The lord's wife lost another one a year later. No one brought it up. Even property disputes took on ridiculous levels of drama. Boundary disagreements might be settled by a line of men lying down, side by side, nose to toe, marking the border with their bodies. Inheritance was a nightmare. Sons from different mothers could claim land equally, which led to feuds, bloodshed, and in one famous case, a sheep's head being mailed to a rival as a warning. Religion didn't help either. Though Ireland had been Christian for centuries, pagan customs still bled through the law. Oaths were sworn on holy relics and stones from ancient cairns. Brehons quoted saints and druids in the same breath. If your field flooded, was it poor irrigation? No. It was because you offended the fairy mound nearby and failed to offer honey at Samhain. Mayor Reid once refused to testify in a case because the dispute took place near a haunted well. The water hears, she said. It remembers. No one questioned her. She didn't even live near the well. So what did justice look like in Aodon's world? It looked like whispered deals in smoky huts, like judgments delivered in verse, like men shaking hands while eyeing each other's cattle, like women bartering dignity for safety, like the poor watching the rich escape again and again behind the sacred shield of tradition. And still, people followed it. Because what was the alternative? Chaos? Violence? A society where no one believed in the system at all? The law may have been absurd, but at least it was shared. They all knew the game, even if it was rigged. Aodon didn't expect fairness. He expected form, a process, a ritual, a way to make sense of the injustices life threw at him. When his cousin was cheated out of land, when his sister's son was killed in a brawl, when his own cow was wrongly taken, all he had was the rhythm of recited laws and the faint hope that someone with power would care. They usually didn't. And so he carried on, kept his head low, paid when he had to, stayed quiet when he couldn't. Justice didn't serve men like him. It entertained them, confused them, and occasionally destroyed them. But it never truly protected them. Still, it was better than nothing, probably. When Aodan walked through the village, he didn't look over his shoulder for bandits. He looked for witnesses. Because in a land where laws were sung instead of written, and justice relied more on memory than evidence, reputation was currency, and gossip was both a weapon and a shield. This wasn't a place of legal documents and signed testimonies. It was a web of stories, of who said what, when, and with how much wine in their belly. Brehon law was technically about compensation and honour, but in practice it was about narrative control. If enough people said you were in the wrong, you were. It didn't matter what actually happened. What mattered was whose version of the story stuck best. Aodan had seen it unfold more than once. A dispute over grazing land turned ugly after one family insisted a neighbour's goat had wandered too far. No fences, of course, just guesswork and grudges. The Brehon was called. Witnesses were summoned, but none had seen the goat stray. That should have been the end of it. Then someone remembered that the accused family didn't attend a feast the previous month. A distant cousin had once refused a blessing from the same priest. Suddenly, the goat wasn't just a goat. It was evidence of disrespect, arrogance, and probably some vague hint of sorcery. The family lost the case. They paid in cheese and dignity. This was normal. The Brehons operated like travelling oracles, deeply learned, slightly terrifying, and always hungry. They quoted laws like incantations, reminding everyone of their duty to memory, morality, and tradition. But beneath the performance was a simple truth. If you had friends, allies, and favours owed, the law bent for you. If you didn't, it broke on you. Mairead had once described the legal system as a harp with broken strings, still pretty, but no one wants to hear it played. She wasn't wrong. There was also the issue of kin liability, one of the crueler quirks in the Brehon tangle. If you broke a law and couldn't pay the fine, your family did. If they refused, they could be shunned, denied food, exiled from festivals, and sometimes even refused burial rites. In the eyes of the law, blood didn't just bind, it ensnared. It meant that one hot-headed nephew could bankrupt an entire household with a single drunken insult. And this wasn't theoretical. Aodan remembered it well. Years ago, his cousin Brehon had gotten into a scuffle during Imbolc, the winter festival. He accused a neighbouring clan's boy of poisoning a pig. The pig died, yes, but from rot, not sorcery. Still, Brehon chased the boy with a sickle and cut him badly. The boy lived, but he bled enough to invoke the law of injury. The Brehon arrived within 3 days, recited the codes, and ruled 4 cows, 2 goats, and public apology sung at the next gathering. Brehon had no cows, barely had pants, so the fine fell to his kin. That meant Aodan's father had to part with 2 of his only animals, an old milker and a calf barely weaned. They never recovered. That winter was lean. And Brehon? He left the village the next week, saying something about opportunity across the water. That was how the law worked. It clung to the innocent and let the guilty drift away. People tried to defend themselves, of course. They could swear oaths. Truth-swearing it was called. Stand before the Brehon, hand on relic or stone, and declare your innocence. The problem? If no one believed you, it meant nothing. Worse, if you swore falsely and it was later discovered, say, if your alibi crumbled or the Brehon just had a bad feeling, you'd be labelled a false swearer. That was social death. No one would trade with you, you'd be barred from ceremonies. And your honour price? Dropped to nothing. You became legally worthless. For Aodan, this meant walking carefully in every aspect of life. You didn't argue in public unless absolutely necessary. You didn't insult someone unless you knew you could afford the fallout. You didn't boast about your land unless you were ready to defend its boundaries with both words and blood. And above all, you didn't rely on justice to save you. You relied on strategy, on alliances, on silence. It wasn't just disputes over property or animals. Even injuries, bodily harm, were resolved with compensation instead of punishment. Each body part had a price. You lost a finger, that's worth 2 cows. An eye, 5, a tooth, depends on where in the mouth, Molars cost more than incisors. Front teeth were slightly cheaper. There was even a chart passed down by the Brehons that listed values for everything from earlobes to fingernails. Mareed once joked that she was worth more dead than alive if anyone took the time to disassemble her properly. Iodine had not laughed. Then there were honour claims. This was when someone felt their dignity had been publicly injured, perhaps by an insult or a broken agreement. These claims were hard to prove and easy to abuse. A particularly clever neighbour once accused another man of withholding a gift promised in a dream. He said the gods had delivered the agreement through sleep, and since everyone knew the gods spoke clearly during the full moon, the promise was valid. The Brehon agreed, perhaps because he had also dreamt of a generous future. The accused man paid a sheep and a cask of ale. From that point on, no one dared to sleep near that neighbour. Justice also came with pageantry. Disputes were often settled at Tulachs, sacred hilltops, where the community gathered, and the Brehon pronounced rulings beneath standing stones and under the watchful eyes of ancestors. These public settings were meant to reinforce order, but they often just embarrassed the parties involved, especially if singing was required. Many a man lost his pride and his pitch in the same day. But despite its absurdities, there was one undeniable truth. The system worked, in its own twisted, poetic way. It prevented blood feuds most of the time. It kept disputes from spiralling into clan wars. It assigned value to lives, to words, to wounds. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded people that every action, no matter how small, had weight. Was it fair? Rarely. Was it moral? Sometimes. Was it survivable? Barely. That was enough. Because in a world where nature already punished them with flood, famine, disease and grief, they didn't need more violence. They needed rules. Even if the rules were irrational. Even if the rules benefited the powerful. Because at least there were rules. Aodan followed them, mostly, because he had no cows left to lose. And gossip, in this village, travelled faster than hoofbeats. If you think being a medieval Irish farmer was the bottom of the barrel, allow us to dig a little deeper. Because beneath the farmers, beneath the free labourers, and beneath even the mud and moss of the fields was another class entirely, the unfree, the bound, the inherited poor. Those who were not just poor in possessions but poor by birth, by blood, by legal status. They were the Dea Fuidhia, the slaves and serfs of Gaelic Ireland, and their lives made Aodans look like a royal sabbatical. Ireland's social pyramid wasn't neat. It wasn't even really a pyramid. It was more like a collapsed hill fort, confusing, crumbling, and layered with centuries of exception, tradition, and contradiction. At the top were the re-kings of varying sizes, from local chieftains to provincial lords. Below them were noble free landowners, then commoners like Aodan, still free but not powerful. And at the very bottom, scraping through life with no rights and fewer expectations, were the unfree classes, slaves, by debt, by conquest, or by inheritance. You could become one in many ways. Born to unfree parents? Congratulations, you're unfree. Captured in a raid? Welcome to forced labour. Owe a debt you can't repay? You now belong to someone else until you work it off. Which, of course, rarely happened. Some people lived entire lives as bondsmen, passing their status down to their children like a bad family recipe. Aodon had grown up beside one such man, Cairbre, stoop-backed and silent, his face like carved bark and hands like tools. He belonged, yes, belonged to a local nobleman who had inherited him as part of a dowry, along with a cow, 3 bronze bowls, and a broken harp. Cairbre tilled fields that weren't his, mended tools he couldn't use, and slept in a barn loft with rats that outranked him socially. And yet, he never complained. That was the rule. You didn't speak unless asked. You didn't stop unless commanded. You were a person, technically, but legally you were closer to a prized ox, useful, movable, and mourned only if expensive. Still, slavery in medieval Ireland wasn't like the mass plantation systems that would come centuries later. It was smaller, more domestic, more personal, and no less brutal for it. You didn't work on vast estates. You worked side by side with your master's family, bound not by chains but by the absolute certainty that you had no alternative. There were no underground railroads here, no revolts, just silence, repetition, and death. Some servants could earn freedom, so a status, through exceptional service, military help, or religious conversion. But it was rare. And even then, freedom didn't mean equality. It meant you were now a poor free man instead of an owned one, a lateral move at best. Others became foster slaves, ifted between households like livestock. Aodon had once seen a young girl, no older than 10, handed over with a rope leash tied around her waist and a basket of rushes balanced on her head. "She's obedient," her owner said. "Doesn't cry at night." That was the full extent of her resume. And no one protested, because poverty breeds silence. Even those not technically enslaved still lived under forms of service that blurred the line. Many peasants were seals, tenants who paid rent in labour, grain, or both. Others were bothaks, courtiers with little more than a mud shack and the hope of not being noticed during tax season. These men were free only in the way that a bird in a broken cage is technically not being held. They could not marry without approval, could not leave without permission, could not defend their land in court unless someone higher up vouched for them. Freedom, in that sense, was an illusion granted to those too poor to pay attention to its absence. Mayreed had once tried to teach a servant boy to read the names of saints. She used charcoal and bark and spent weeks pointing out letters. When his master found out, the boy was beaten, not for wasting time, but for reaching above his station. "He'll start thinking," the master said, "and then he'll want." Desire was dangerous. The system worked only because most people didn't believe they deserved better, or didn't know they could. Ironically, the church, while offering spiritual equality, often reinforced social division. Monasteries relied on servile labour to function. They blessed the poor, then put them to work building walls and harvesting leeks. Clerics taught that suffering cleansed the soul. Convenient advice for the ones doing the beating. Still, there were rare moments of rebellion, not loud or bloody, but quiet and sharp. Mayreed once hid a pregnant servant girl in her hut overnight after the girl's master accused her of stealing milk. The girl left at dawn, barefoot and trembling, never to be seen again. Aodon said nothing. He never asked if the milk had actually been stolen. It didn't matter. Innocence was a luxury the poor couldn't afford. Even among the free, status was a constant concern. Aodon was always aware of who outranked him, who could speak over him, who could strike him without consequence. A cousin of his had been accused of laziness and forced to labour an extra season as penance. Not because he'd failed his duties, but because he'd looked a landowner in the eye for too long. That was considered insolent, disrespectful, punishable. It wasn't always physical control. Often it was economic. Debt could make a man a slave faster than any sword. Borrow a cow, fail to return it, and you might lose your home. Marry without proper dowry, your children might grow up bonded. There was no bankruptcy court. There was just servitude. Still, people held on to scraps of dignity. Cairbre, for instance, carved intricate knots into the handles of every tool he used. He said it made the wood remember him. When he died, the noble's son threw those tools in the river, said they were cursed. Maybe they were. And what about hope? It came in moments. A festival where a servant was allowed to dance. A field where a bonded man sowed seeds he'd one day eat. A Brehon who ruled, shockingly, in favour of a foster slave girl who'd lost a finger in the churn. A monk who taught a boy to write a single word, truth. That was enough to keep going. Sometimes. But Aodon knew the truth, so did Mayreed. Freedom wasn't a right in their world, it was a gamble. And most people lost. So they worked, they bent, they endured. Because there was no ladder, just a pit. And the only way out was not to climb, but to disappear entirely. Evening came down like a damp blanket in medieval Ireland. The smoke curling out of hearths wasn't just warmth, it was a curtain behind which countless people like Cairbre faded into shadow. If you weren't born free, you didn't disappear dramatically. You disappeared slowly, day by day, chore by chore, into a fog of obedience and exhaustion. Your name didn't enter the records. Your legacy was not carved into stone. You were known only by who owned you, and when that name faded, so did you. Cairbre had worked alongside Aodan's family for as long as anyone could remember. He didn't live with them. He belonged to a wealthier cousin, but often passed through to help with shearing or scything when labour was short. His silence was famous. A whole week could pass without him saying more than 10 words. He knew his place, and his place knew him. What the law never said, but what everyone understood, was that the unfree bled more and mattered less. If Cairbre were injured in the field, there'd be no compensation, no legal claim, no Brehon summoned to balance the scales. His pain belonged to his master. His body was a tool. When tools broke, you fixed them, or you threw them away. It wasn't hatred, it was invisibility. A calm, practiced ignoring that stretched across generations. Mayrad once said that when the truly poor died, their ghosts didn't even haunt the land. They just blended into the mist, indistinguishable from fog or smoke. Still, the hierarchy remained meticulous. Not all unfree were equal. Some were house servants, slightly better fed and occasionally trusted with errands or children. Others were field labourers, with cracked hands and backs bent in permanent apology. A few were skilled bondsmen, blacksmiths, tanners or weavers whose talent kept them from the worst fates but didn't grant them freedom. In rare cases, a master might grant partial liberty, allowing a slave to live independently or own property. But such cases were whispered about like miracles, not expected. The church offered the illusion of equality. Inside stone chapels, rich and poor knelt side by side. But outside, it was different. Cairbre still had to bow, still had to keep his eyes down, still had to eat last, speak least, and thank the Lord for pain that might one day be redeemed in heaven. There were no sermons about justice, just endurance, just sin and penance and waiting for eternity to fix what this world refused to. And yet, even in this hollow framework, the enslaved and the bound found ways to live, if not freely, then defiantly. Cairbre carved symbols into wood. Others sang forbidden songs, verses passed down from older generations that carried stories of better days, hidden saints, or half-remembered gods who punished unjust masters. These songs weren't revolutionary, they weren't shouted in protest, but they clung to life like moss to stone, quietly resisting the erasure of identity. Children born into servitude were told 2 things: work hard and be invisible. Their parents prayed they might marry up, find favour, or be taken in by a kindly cleric. But such hopes were like building with smoke, possible in dreams, impossible in structure. Most simply followed their parents into the same roles, same huts, same chores. By the time they were 10, they knew what their lives would be. Not because it was fate, but because no one gave them a reason to expect anything else. There was no education. Teaching the unfree to read or reckon was seen as a threat. A literate servant might question their condition. A numerate one might notice how often they were cheated. So they stayed ignorant, not by nature, but by design. The law didn't forbid them from learning. It just made sure there was no one to teach them. Still, knowledge leaked through. Old women whispered charms, midwives passed on herbal remedies, and the occasional monk taught a loyal servant to recite Latin prayers phonetically. Mayrad once watched a servant girl trace letters in the dirt while her master wasn't looking. The girl didn't know their meaning, she just liked the shape. When Mayrad smiled at her, the girl quickly erased the marks with her heel, not out of shame, but out of fear. The truth was that servitude relied on silence, but people never stopped speaking. They just lowered their voices. Cairbre, when younger, had told Aodan stories of a mythical land beyond the western sea where no man owned another. He'd heard it from a traveller, or maybe imagined it. Either way, the idea lingered. Mayrad once said that even false hopes were still hopes, better than none, but not all unfree accepted their fate quietly. There were stories, real or imagined, of runaways. bondsmen who vanished into the woods, joined wandering bands, or sought protection from rival clans. These fugitives lived dangerous lives, often hunted and punished harshly if caught. One captured man had his ears cut to mark him. Another was hobbled. Another, unconfirmed, was drowned in a peat bog as warning to others. The law didn't permit killing slaves lightly, but then again it didn't stop anyone with enough influence and a convenient lack of witnesses. Aodan had never known anyone to escape, but he'd seen the fear ripple through the village when a servant went missing, the questions, the suspicions, the tightened curfews. It reminded everyone that freedom was not just a gift, it was a threat. And then there was religion. Saints' days and holy processions offered brief moments of equality, when even servants could wear flowers and dance. But behind every chant was a reminder heaven is just, because earth isn't. People like Carberry were taught to wait for paradise because this world wasn't theirs. But what happens when waiting becomes unbearable? When the songs lose their meaning? When the smoke in your chest becomes heavier than hope? You keep moving. You shear the sheep. You turn the soil. You spin the thread. Not because you believe things will change, but because not working means not eating, and hunger is more immediate than injustice. That was the brilliance and cruelty of the system. It didn't require violence. It ran on acceptance. Not cheerful, not enthusiastic, but deep, bitter, exhausted acceptance. Aodan knew that well. He looked at Kebra sometimes and thought, if I'd been born to a poorer father, that would have been me. And then he looked away, because staring too long into someone else's suffering meant admitting your own wasn't much better, just quieter, just slightly more tolerable, just free enough to feel ashamed for complaining. The truth is, there was no great divide between peasant and slave in Ireland, only a thin line scribbled in mud, reinforced by custom and smoothed out by rain. And every time a storm came through, the line blurred again. Chapter 7. Rain on the Ricks. Farming in a land that hated you. If you want to understand suffering in its purest form, don't look to the battlefield or the prison. Look to the field. A sodden, miserable Irish field, slumped under leaden skies, where a man with splintered tools and a grumbling stomach tries, day after day, to convince the earth to give him something back. Welcome to agriculture in medieval Ireland. A long, wet argument between man and the mud always had the last word. Aodan had been farming since he could walk. His first memory was of pulling weeds from a barley patch with his mother, the ground so cold it numbed his toes, the sky so low it kissed the back of his neck with drizzle. He didn't remember warmth. Not really, only warmth interrupted by water rain that never stopped falling, even when the sun pretended to shine. The land wasn't generous. It was peat, rock, clay, and bog. You didn't plough it so much as negotiate with it. Fields were cleared with fire or brute strength, stones piled in crooked walls as both boundary and prayer. There was no concept of large-scale irrigation, no fancy ditches, no engineered fertility. You hoped the slope drained the water. You hoped the compost didn't attract rats. You hoped the saints remembered your name when the weather turned. And yet they farmed, day in, day out, because what else was there? Aodan's fields were barely a quarter-acre each, scattered across uneven hills, divided not by fences but by memory. That patch where the dog chased the hare, or the strip below the widow's ash tree. He rotated crops because the land demanded it, not because he read it in a manual. Oats 1 year, barley the next, rye if the gods smiled, and flax sometimes if they had nothing better to do than curse themselves with back-breaking textile labour. The tools, laughable. A wooden ploughshare tipped with iron if you were rich or desperate. Harrows made from branches and stones, sickles sharpened on river rocks, spades carved by hand and splintered with every third use. Every task took 3 times longer than it should have. Every injury was a potential death sentence. Still, they tilled. Farming was a family affair, not in the cosy, warm-hearted storybook sense, but in the everyone works or everyone starves sense. The children collected dung for fertilizer. Mairead scalded nettles for pest repellent. Aodan broke his back, turning soil so thin it could barely hold a seed, praying each time the clouds rolled in that the rain would feed, not drown, the roots. And oh, the rain. It didn't fall, it arrived. Like a relative you didn't invite, staying just long enough to ruin everything. The joke, if you could call it that, was that Ireland had 2 seasons, rain and more rain. Sunshine was rare, suspicious, and usually meant a storm was coming to balance the mistake. Crops rotted in the field, that was normal, too much wet, and your barley fermented before you harvested it. Your oats moulded, your rye withered. You didn't cry. You turned the rotten grain into weak beer and drank your mistakes. Preserving anything edible became a daily obsession. Grains were dried over smoky fires, sometimes mixed with ash to keep the weevils at bay. Root vegetables were buried deep under earth or stone, and still half of them came out soft and sour. Nothing lasted. Everything spoiled. Mould was as familiar as mud. Farming in medieval Ireland wasn't just labour. It was ritual. You didn't sow without blessing the seed. You didn't reap without thanking the field. Every stone turned over was a gamble. Might be a root, might be a curse. Every strange mushroom was a question, food, medicine, or death. Aodan had a pouch of charms for farming days. A twig wrapped in red thread. A small bone. A worn St. medallion with half the face rubbed off. Superstition wasn't decoration, it was insurance. Because when everything else failed, when the soil betrayed you, the sky cursed you, and your cow gave birth to a stillborn calf, what else did you have but magic? Even pests had a mystical presence. Mice weren't just vermin, they were often believed to be witches in disguise. Crows were messengers. Beetles foretold the weather. Every rustle in the grass had meaning. A good farmer wasn't just a planter, he was a listener, an interpreter of signs, a man with one eye on the ground and the other watching for omens. And then came hunger. Not starvation, though that happened too, but the low, persistent ache of not enough. Not enough to fill the bowl, not enough to sell, not enough to make it to next month without thinning the stew. They had a word for this kind of hunger, gorta. A deep, communal emptiness that pressed down on villages like a fog. When the gorta came, you learned to be still, to speak less, to chew slower. Mairead once boiled dock leaves and wild onions for 2 days straight, trying to coax flavour out of famine. She added thistle root, old bread, and a lump of pig fat from a festival 3 weeks gone. It tasted like regret and smoke. They ate it anyway. Aodan tried trapping birds when the harvest failed. He caught one. It was mostly feathers. They shared it like a relic. The children laughed while chewing it. They were too young to be bitter yet. Tools broke often. There were no replacements. You tied things with sinew. You patched handles with rawhide. You worked with what you had. And when that failed, you got creative. Aodan once used a bone to dig out weeds. It worked better than the rusted trowel he'd been using. No one asked whose bone it had been. Still, despite everything, farming gave a sense of control. It was your field, your seeds, your blistered hand shaping a future no one else would build for you. It was hard, yes, but it was honest. Unlike the law, unlike the chieftain, unlike the priest who blessed your harvest and then taxed your barley. The truth? The land didn't hate them. It simply didn't care. And that, in some ways, was worse. Because you could curse a man, you could reason with a thief, but you couldn't plead with a field that just didn't want to grow anything this year. You could only bow your head, dig deeper, and pray that this time, this one season, it would give more than it took. Aodan knelt by his barley patch that evening. The rain had stopped, finally. The sky was bruised with dusk, the soil cool and damp. He pressed his fingers into the earth and felt nothing, no promise, no warning, just dirt. Still, tomorrow he would wake before dawn. Still, he would try again. Morning in the field wasn't peaceful, it was damp, aching, and immediate. Aodan's knees sank into the soil with a familiar squelch, the sort of sensation that told him exactly how much the crop had suffered overnight. A quarter of his barley had bent sideways under the rain. Not flooded, not drowned, just sulking. And there was no fixing it. You couldn't untangle grain like hair. You either cut it down early and risked poor yield, or prayed it would straighten up by itself and risk rot. Either way, you lost. He stood there in the fog for a long while, chewing a piece of straw and letting the silence weigh on him. This was the constant negotiation of medieval Irish farming, never deciding between good and bad, only between two different shades of disappointment. The soil, deceptively dark and rich, held a curse in every inch. Too much rain, and it turned sour. Too little, and too little, meant only 2 dry weeks. It cracked into hard, bitter slabs. Even when the weather cooperated, the pests didn't. Rabbits chewed through seedlings like drunken guests at a banquet. Birds circled like prophets of doom. Insects thrived with a joy that bordered on cruelty. And there were no pesticides. There was shouting, clapping, burning dried herbs, and the occasional invocation of San Fiacca, patron of farmers. Aodon sometimes tied bits of red cloth to his scarecrow, more rag than human figure, believing the colour frightened the crows. It didn't. They nested in its arms and laughed as far as he could tell. Worse were the underground thieves. Grubs, worms, moles. Mayrad once swore that a mole had eaten half a carrot crop. Aodhan joked that at least something was getting fat. She didn't laugh. They tried traps, pits, even burying thorn branches along furrows. None of it worked for long. Every time they killed one pest, another arrived. It was as if the land had made a pact with the vermin. We'll pretend to be fertile if you promise to ruin everything that grows here. And when pests failed, disease stepped in. There was no science to farming, only patterns, only memory. If the leaves curled, it meant rain had come too early. If the roots smelled sour, there was something in the soil. Maybe a buried body. Maybe bad luck. Either way, you scraped it out, muttered a prayer, and tried again. Crop failure was so common that farmers didn't ask if it would happen. They asked how badly. A light failure meant less bread, fewer beer batches, smaller stews. A full failure meant starvation. And when that came, when the gorta, the hunger, arrived, it didn't announce itself dramatically. It came quietly, like fog creeping up your sleeves. First, the bread grew thinner. Then the milk stopped. Then the children stopped running, then laughing, then speaking. Your neighbours stopped greeting you in the morning. Everyone's eyes sank. Everyone's hands trembled. And still, people worked. Because work gave the illusion of progress. If you kept sowing, maybe the next season would be kind. Maybe. Preservation helped, but only just. Grains were kept in sacks hung from the rafters to keep out the mice. They smoked meats when they had them, packed salted fish in barrels that leaked, and buried turnips under rocks. Mayrad once wrapped apples in old wool and tucked them beneath the floor. Some stayed good. Others exploded from rot and spread a smell that clung to the house for days. There were no cellars, no refrigeration, no pickling science. Just instinct and desperation. One year, a clever monk introduced boiled butter to the village, burying barrels of churned butter deep in the peat to preserve it. The first attempt was successful. The second turned rancid. The third disappeared entirely. They suspected Kebra's cousin. He denied it with his mouth full. Still, it was a clever trick, and Aodhan remembered it. On lean years, when they managed a surplus, he dug his own pit, sealed it with moss and prayer. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the butter came out smelling like feet and failure. The truth was, even abundance was dangerous. Too much harvest drew attention. People noticed. They borrowed. They raided. Grain stores were like gold visible wealth in a land of shared poverty. It wasn't unusual for a well-off family to find their thatch torched during a winter night, only to discover their oat barrels missing the next morning. No one accused anyone. No one ever did. Because everyone understood. Even celebrations carried this undercurrent of fear. During Luvnasad, the harvest festival, people danced and drank and gave thanks, but always cautiously. Always with the knowledge that this good year might be followed by 2 bad ones. that full bellies today might mean emptier ones tomorrow. They blessed the fields, sang songs to the grain gods, drank sour ale and hoped. Hope was the real harvest. Food was just the bonus. Farming didn't just shape bodies, it shaped minds. Aodan didn't think in weeks or months, he thought in seasons. He planned around rainfall, not dates. Time wasn't measured by birthdays, but by lambing, shearing, planting, reaping and dying. Everything came in cycles, most of them harsh. Mairead kept a planting calendar scratched into a plank above the hearth. Not a proper one, just symbols. A sun for sowing, a droplet for prayer, a skull for the month the cow died. It was more emotional record than farming guide. Even religion bent to the harvest. Mass was held in fields as often as churches. Priests wore mud on their hems. Saints were invoked with hands still dirty from planting. When a storm knocked down half the barley crop, the priest led a procession around the remaining field, sprinkling it with water and singing in Latin no one understood. Aodan watched with arms folded. Mairead crossed herself. The barley still died, and yet they endured. Because what choice did they have? Farming wasn't a job, it was existence. It gave no rewards, only extensions. One more month, one more week, one more winter survived. That evening, as Aodan sat beside the field, chewing a bit of dried dock and watching the mist settle, he considered what it meant to be a farmer in this land. Not wealth, not pride, not even ownership. It meant surrender. You surrendered your back, your time, your hope, and sometimes your dignity. You gave it all to the land. And if it liked you, it fed you. If not, it buried you. Chapter 8. Festival days were rare, and they still hurt. Once in a while the smoke in the air changed. It wasn't from the hearth, or the field, or the funeral pyre. It came from bonfires lit with purpose, high and proud, not low and grim, and it signalled something rare, a festival day. For a medieval Irish farmer like Aodan, such days didn't come gently. They arrived like a slap to the face, loud, bright, and confusing. A sudden burst of song and drink and communal chaos in a life otherwise shaped by drudgery and rot. But let's be clear, these were not days off. The medieval Irish peasant didn't have vacations, he had disruptions. A festival was a short, sharp release valve, more pressure cooker than picnic. You didn't rest. You performed. You cooked. You cleaned. You carved symbols into bark and placed them under stones. You prepared offerings. You danced yourself sick. Then you returned to the field, hungover and bruised, and acted like it had all been worth it. There were 4 major seasonal festivals: Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lughnasadh, marking the transitions of the agricultural calendar. Each had its mood, its rituals, and its hazards. But none brought true ease, only ritualized distraction. Samhain, in late autumn, was a favourite and a fear. It was the thinning of the veil, when the dead walked freely and the spirits listened closely. People carved turnips, grotesque, hollowed-out things to scare off wandering souls, and placed them near doors. Aodan had made one every year since he was a boy. His never looked like anything human. That was the point. Bonfires were lit high on hills, and the flame was said to purify. Cattle were driven between twin fires to cleanse them for winter. If a cow balked or refused, it was considered cursed. One year, Mairead's father's herd had refused to pass between the flames. The next month, they all died from hoof rot. Ever since, she'd watched their animals closely during Samhain. Any hesitation was noted, any limp, any snort. Saints forgive you, but cows remember. Children dressed in tattered cloaks and smeared ash on their faces to confuse the spirits. If you looked too human, you were fair game. If you looked strange enough, maybe the dead wouldn't recognize you. But while the air swirled with fear, the food was better, if only for a night. Turnip stew, oatcakes with bits of dried berry, curdled cheese, even honeyed bread if someone had bartered wisely. Mairead made a special loaf each Samhain with a coin baked inside. Whoever found it was said to have luck. One year, Aodan bit the coin and cracked a molar. Mairead said it meant his luck would be hard-earned. It was. Then came Imbolc, deep in winter, sacred to Brigid saint and goddess both, depending on who you asked. It was a woman's festival. Merad laid rushes under the hearth, braided them into crosses, hung them above the door. A white cloth was left outside overnight to be blessed by the passing Brigid, then kept to treat illness. Aodan was sceptical, until she pressed the cloth to a boil on his leg and the pain faded. He said nothing. Imbolc was about hope, as absurd as that sounds in February. Seeds were still underground. Food was running thin. People walked the edge between survival and surrender, but Imbolc reminded them that spring would come. Eventually. Maybe. Beltane was the opposite, fire and fertility. It marked the start of summer, when cows were sent to summer pastures, and humans reminded each other that life should be made in warm weather. Couples jumped fires, maidens danced around poles. Aodan found the whole thing exhausting. Not because he was old, but because it required emotion, and he had none left by May. Still, he walked the fields with Merad that night, barefoot, as tradition required. The grass was damp. The stars were sharp. He held her hand like it was the only solid thing in the world. Maybe it was. But the grandest was Love-Nasad, the harvest festival. It was the only time of year when people might feel full. Bread was baked in giant loads, hard enough to crack teeth but sacred all the same. The first grain was milled, blessed, and eaten with solemnity. If it tasted sour, the year would be bitter. If sweet, fortunes would rise. There were games too. Mock battles, races, wrestling. Aodan never competed. He wasn't built for spectacle, but he watched, sometimes with a smirk. Young men puffing their chests. Old men pretending their knees didn't ache. Children laughing so hard they fell over. It was a kind of madness, a kind of grace. And yet, these festivals still hurt, because you saw what you didn't have. The rich arrived in cleaner tunics, bringing gifts. Monks led processions with incense, their bellies round, their fingers soft. Even local lords sometimes joined, riding horses that looked better fed than most children. You stood beside them, eating your burnt oatcake, and pretended it didn't bother you. Merid hated those moments. Not because of envy, she was too tired for that, but because it reminded her that joy was rationed too. Some people were allowed more. Some people deserved more, they were told. She didn't believe it. But believing changed nothing. The children noticed too. They asked why some families had meat while others chewed roots, why some wore linen while others had patched sacks. You answered with stories, about fairness, about faith, about how the gods would balance the scales eventually. Then you looked at the scales and they were still broken. After the dancing, after the fires, after the food was gone and the songs fell silent, everyone returned to their huts, to the smoke, to the damp, to the aching shoulders and the unwashed feet. Festival joy evaporated fast. You went to bed hungrier than you'd admit and woke with the same debts. Still, you went every year, not because you loved it, but because it reminded you that life had a shape beyond digging and dying, that you were part of something older than yourself, something that remembered before hunger. And sometimes, when the fire burned just right, and the drum beat loud enough to shake the bones, and someone passed you a cup of something fermented and forgiving, you believed, for just a heartbeat, that you were more than a tired farmer in a wet field. You were human, and that was worth dancing for. By the morning after a festival, the magic had thinned like stale smoke. The ashes of the bonfire were already cold, the leftover stew souring in clay bowls, and the villagers' voices raspy from too much shouting, laughing, or singing, depending on who had the stronger lungs. The festival was over, and what was left behind wasn't joy. It was soreness, spilled grain, broken tools, and at least one drunken uncle passed out behind the chicken shed. Aodan stepped around him without a word. He'd seen worse. Because festival days didn't just offer fleeting happiness. They also revealed what the village tried to ignore the rest of the year. Grudges that had simmered during winter boiled over when beer and bragging collided. Old insults, unpaid debts, jealousies over land, daughters, or livestock. These things surfaced like rot beneath the surface of a spring field. One wrong word could turn a game into a fistfight. One glance too long at someone's wife and you'd be settling the matter behind the well with fists and sticks while the priest pretended not to notice. Aodan had witnessed this often. A feast of Lughnasadh might begin with holy blessings and harp music, but it was just as likely to end with a bloodied nose and someone swearing vengeance while being held back by two barefoot cousins. And if a young man died during a wrestling match, or someone fell into a fire while drunk, well, that was just festival misfortune. The kind you'd chalk up to the fairies or St. Bridget's disapproval, depending on the crowd. Even disease loved a good festival. With people packed together in celebration, coughing, sweating, sharing cups and fingers in communal bread, sickness spread like spilled milk on a tilted table. Children came home with rashes. Old men began to cough. Someone always lost their voice. And if it was bad, if the gods were in a foul mood, that cough turned into fever, and then someone didn't wake up. Mary'd always scrubbed the bowls extra hard after a feast day. She didn't trust joy, not when it came from other people's mouths. Then there were the accidents. A bonfire collapse. A cracked rib from a drunken race. A boy scalded while trying to carry soup. These things weren't unusual, they were expected. A good festival only had minor injuries. That's what people said. If no one lost a tooth, it meant you hadn't danced hard enough. The children still loved it, of course. They chased one another with rush dolls, smeared ash on their cheeks, and stuffed their mouths with bread until their bellies hurt. But even they weren't spared the sharp edges of festival life. Aodan's youngest once stepped on a fire-coal shard hidden under dirt. His scream cut through the dancing like a crow's cry. They wrapped the foot in wet moss. It healed crooked. He limped for years. And yet no one questioned the festival itself, because it was all they had. A brief rupture in the relentless rhythm of survival, a day to pretend you weren't poor, weren't hungry, weren't owned by your labour, even if the morning after proved otherwise. Still, it wasn't only injury and illness, it was also comparison. Festivals were mirrors, and not everyone liked what they saw. You could lie to yourself all year about your place in the village. You could pretend that being poor wasn't so bad. But during a feast, when you watched others dance in fine linen or offer whole wheels of cheese to the priest, reality became sharp. You saw the divide. You tasted it in your watered ale. You heard it in the way people's laughter changed when you approached. Aodan remembered watching a neighbour receive praise for his bread. A fat loaf, golden and fragrant, people cheered. Then someone asked Aodan if he'd brought anything. He nodded toward his small barley cake, flat and cracked from the fire. No one said anything. They just turned back toward the music. Mary'd called that the festival silence. Not cruel, not loud, just a quiet erasure. The way certain people were always slightly out of focus when the feast was tallied and remembered. Sometimes the pressure of pretending overwhelmed people. Women broke down in corners, weeping quietly into their shawls. Men stumbled into the woods alone. You weren't allowed to show despair during the celebration, but everyone felt it. It hung behind the music like smoke behind a curtain. Even the priests, with their prayers and pomp, knew not to look too closely. They offered blessings, waved their relics, and avoided eye contact with the man who'd just been whipped for poaching a rabbit. Forgiveness was cheap when guilt was poor. And yet, no matter how bitter the aftermath, they all came back the next year. Because even one night of dancing was better than none. Even stale bread shared in company was better than a full belly in silence. Even hollow laughter was a rebellion against despair. Aodan understood that. That was why he always carved a small figure for each festival. Just a bit of wood, shaped like a dancing man or a smiling cow or a sun. He hid them under stones in the field after the feast. Not as offerings. As reminders. That even in the worst years, someone had danced, someone had smiled. Even if just for a moment. Mary'd saved flower garlands long past their death. She kept them in bundles above the hearth, tied with twine and prayer. When Aodan asked why, she said, to remember we once had colour. And maybe that was the point, not to escape pain, but to remember joy so fiercely that it left a mark deeper than hunger. Because the field always came back, the rain always returned, the smoke always swallowed the songs. But for a single night, once or twice a year, you danced anyway, and that mattered. Chapter 9. Religion and Superstition. Priests, pagans, and protection spells. There was no such thing as just religion in medieval Ireland. There was no clear line between faith and fear, no border between saints and spirits. For someone like Éodain, belief was a daily act of survival, not salvation. You crossed yourself before milking the cow, muttered a spell while stirring the stew, left offerings at the edge of the field and went to Mass on Sunday. Not because you were indecisive, but because you didn't dare leave any force unacknowledged, just in case. Christianity had long since come to Ireland, but it had arrived quietly, more like a guest than a conqueror. And while the churches were made of stone, the old gods still lingered in trees and streams and holes in the hills. The people had absorbed the Gospels like another layer of thatch on the roof, necessary, respected, but never the only layer. If the saints could help, you called them. If they didn't, well, there were older names, deeper ones, names you didn't say too loudly. Éodain had been baptized in a cold stream, blessed by a priest who stank of incense and onions, and taught his prayers by a monk with fingers like knots. But most of his real beliefs were passed on by Mairead, and her mother before her. She kept a bundle of herbs by the door, not for flavour, but for protection. Mugwort, yarrow and rowan twigs, to keep away the fairies. Or to confuse them at least. Every corner of their hut had meaning. The hearth was sacred, Brigid's place. You never spit near it, never cursed around it. The threshold was guarded by iron nails driven into the lintel to keep spirits from entering uninvited. And the fields? Full of things you didn't see but felt. You never cut the first mushroom. You never whistled near a lone hawthorn. You never, ever disturbed a fairy ring unless you were eager to watch your cow die or your child fall ill. It wasn't madness, it was precaution. Because the world was full of things that punished carelessness. The saints could be distant, but the spirits? They were close, petty, quick to anger. You respected them the same way you respected fire. Useful, yes, but capable of burning down everything. The priest in the village, Father San, did his best to tidy these beliefs. He preached sermons about sin, humility, and penance. He reminded people that bread was sacred and the Virgin watched from every cloud. But even he knew better than to speak against the old ways too directly. He'd watched a man mock the fairies once, laughed at a tale about a changeling child, and 3 days later the man's goats ran into the sea, all of them, without hesitation. Gone. Father Cian never mocked again. Éodain saw no contradiction in lighting a candle to Saint Ciaron in the morning and tying a red thread around his son's wrist at night. One guarded the soul, the other guarded the body. Why risk either? Illness, especially, lived in that blurry space between spiritual and physical. If a child grew thin and pale, refused to eat, and stared blankly at the fire, it might be a fever, or it might be the fairies. Some said the real child had been stolen and replaced. Mairead had whispered such fears once, long ago, when their firstborn stopped crying for 2 days straight. She put iron scissors under his pillow and left a bowl of milk outside the door. He recovered. She never spoke of it again. Even childbirth had its rituals. Women gave birth crouched near the hearth with salt on their tongues and holy water nearby. But behind the curtain of prayer, older customs lingered, knots untied in the house to ensure smooth labour, a candle placed in the woman's hand to keep away death spirits, a chant repeated by the midwife that had nothing to do with the Bible and everything to do with the moon. Death, too, was never simple. When someone died, the mirrors were covered. Clocks stopped. The body was never left alone, not just for grief, but because if the soul wandered and found an empty house, it might decide to stay. Coins were placed on the eyes, not just for burial tradition, but to pay any lingering spirit or stranger who might try to follow the soul into the afterlife. It was all layered Christian burial on pagan bones. And then there were the curses. Real ones. Everyone knew someone who'd been hexed. A a bad harvest without reason, a sudden sickness, milk that turned sour no matter how clean the bucket. Sometimes it was jealousy, sometimes a broken promise, sometimes just bad luck given shape and name. Aodan had been accused once, long ago, by a widow whose sheep miscarried after he'd refused her a bundle of firewood. She stood in the village square, pointed her twisted hand at him and said, "You'll know the taste of ash before winter's end." That winter his hut caught fire. No one could prove anything. But no one doubted either. To break a curse you visited the bean feaser, the wise woman. Every village had one, not a witch exactly, though some called her that, a healer, a midwife, a keeper of secrets. Mayraid visited one when their daughter fell ill. The woman mixed herbs, muttered over a bowl of water, and burned a braid of the child's hair. She charged a loaf of bread and a promise never to return unless truly necessary. The girl recovered. Faith was never singular. It was a collection layered, contradictory, stubborn. Saints guarded some places. Spirits guarded others. The church offered structure. The old ways offered detail. Together they built a spiritual safety net full of holes and patches, but better than nothing. Even language reflected this. God willing was said in the same breath as, if the fairies don't mind. Holy days were celebrated on sacred ground that had once belonged to older gods. Baptisms took place at wells where sacrifices had once been made. The cross and the circle lived side by side. And for all their fears, the people weren't broken by this tangled belief. They were held together by it. In a world where justice failed, crops died, and life was rarely fair, belief gave shape to the chaos. A way to blame, a way to plead, a way to hope. Aodan didn't ask if the saints were real. He didn't need to. He saw their footprints in the frost, their warnings in the wind. And if he was wrong, if none of it was real, then at least he had tried. At least he had spoken to the world, instead of suffering in silence. He still muttered a prayer before planting. Still spit in the fire if he burned his finger. Still left milk by the door on certain nights. Because it cost nothing to be careful, and it cost everything to be wrong. For the sick in medieval Ireland, there were two paths, one paved with scripture and one carved from shadow. Most people walked both, because when fever clung to the chest like a curse and the skin flushed hot as the hearthstone, you didn't waste time choosing sides. You threw every form of faith and superstition at the illness and hoped something stuck. When Aodan's second son, Lorcan, began convulsing after a night of vomiting and delirium, they called both the priest and the bean feaser. Father Cian came first, clutching a chipped crucifix and muttering Latin that even he barely understood. He sprinkled holy water on the boy's face, drew a cross in soot on the hearthstone, and urged the family to confess any sins. Mairead nodded solemnly, her eyes fixed on the pale, twitching child, but in her lap she was already crushing dried feverfew between her fingers. When the priest left, she sent Aodan to fetch the wise woman. She arrived, wrapped in layers of wool and mystery. Her eyes were cloudy, but her hands moved fast, mixing herbs, tying charms, lighting a clump of dried horsehair she insisted must smoulder in the room for exactly 6 minutes. She muttered old words that didn't belong to Latin or Irish, but something older, more bone-deep. She took a strand of Lorcan's hair, burned it, watched the flame, and said nothing. Then she left. The boy survived. But for years after, Mairead kept a pouch of his baby teeth buried under the threshold, to keep his soul anchored, she said. Aodan never questioned it, because in their world, healing was never just physical. It was spiritual, emotional, ancestral. Pain didn't come alone. It came with meaning, with causes hidden in slighted spirits, angry ancestors, or forgotten prayers. And you never fought illness with logic. You fought it with layers, saint's water, nettle broth, ash circles on the floor, whispered apologies to invisible ears. Every household had its own combinations. Mairead's medicine chest was a row of bundles tucked in the rafters, peppermint, foxglove, angelica, bark, berries, roots with names older than scripture. She knew what cooled a fever and what stopped bleeding. She knew how much of a leaf could save and how much could kill. She also knew how to read dreams, how to listen for bad luck in the wail of a keening wind. Father Sian disapproved. He said healing belonged to God and any other path was dangerous. But even he drank her nettle tea when his gut burned. He just never said thank you. Dreams were another matter entirely. In a village with no books, no letters, no maps, dreams were the literature of the soul, full of symbols, animals, colours, warnings. If you dreamt of a fox, it meant betrayal. A crow meant death. A running river meant change. No one claimed to fully understand them, but no one ignored them either. Aodan once dreamt of a field of black barley. The next morning he walked out to find his crop flattened by wind and rain. He never doubted the message. He simply muttered that the gods should speak more clearly next time. But even with all these rituals, these protections, people still died. Often. Easily. A thorn puncture could turn to infection. A cough could become plague. A strange rash on the chest might mean nothing, or it might mean 3 days left. And when people died, no one blamed the body. They blamed the balance. Some rule had been broken, some force offended. That's why blame mattered so much. When a cow went dry, people whispered. If 3 children in a row caught fever, people stared. If a woman miscarried twice, someone was surely cursing her. There didn't have to be proof, just a feeling, just enough glances at the wrong moment. Mairead once warned Aodan not to stare at Bridget's butter churn too long. She's jealous of her yield, she said. She'll think you're measuring it for yourself. It sounded absurd, but he looked away. Because in this world, envy was more dangerous than theft. A thief could be caught. Envy lingered in the air, unseen, infecting cows and dreams and children's lungs. So people took precautions. They salted their doorways. They turned cloaks inside out when walking alone. They tied iron scissors above cradles and never spoke a newborn's name aloud until it was baptized, in case something else heard and claimed it. And what about the places themselves? The land, the trees, the rocks? They weren't passive. The old gods were gone, but their footprints remained. There were certain stones you didn't move, certain trees you didn't cut. Fairy forts, round mounds in the fields, were never touched. If a plough caught one by accident, the blade was left there. Better to lose a tool than offend the hidden ones. Aodan's grandfather had once built a shed over a known fairy path. Within a year, his wife was blind, his son had drowned, and his prize ram keeled over in the middle of a wedding. The shed was torn down. No one built there again. Religion and fear. Blessing and bribe. That's what belief looked like in medieval Ireland. Not clean lines of doctrine, but knotted ropes of ritual, tugging back and forth between saint and spirit, between the church bell and the whisper in the woods. And somehow, despite the contradictions, it worked. Not because it stopped the suffering, but because it gave it context, gave it meaning, gave it shape. Aodan didn't know if the saints truly watched, or if the fairies truly stole children. He just knew that silence greeted the careless, and protection came only to those who remembered, who acted, who obeyed the rhythm of the old and the new, even when that rhythm made no sense. So when Mairead traced a circle of ash around the threshold each Samhain, he stepped over it carefully. When she hung dried rowan over the hearth, he never questioned the placement. When she lit a candle for Sam Ciaran and placed a coin under it for the other ones, he didn't ask which side she meant. Because belief wasn't about understanding. It was about not being alone in the chaos. Chapter 10. Beyond the Hedge. Wolves, raiders, and the edge of the known. There was a point in every Irish village, somewhere between the last crooked fence post and the first line of ash trees, where the world changed. It wasn't marked on any map. It didn't need to be. You felt it. A stillness in the air, a hush in the grass, as if even the soil knew this was where the village ended and something else began. For Aodan, that point lay just past the marshy trail behind their grazing field. Cross it, and you weren't in home territory anymore. You were in the wild, the ungoverned, the not ours. Children were warned early, never stray past the bog without a reason. Never follow a fox into the trees, never pick berries from bushes that stood alone. Some said it was because of wolves. Others whispered about older things. Both were right, because beyond the hedge, life didn't just get harder, it got stranger. The forest itself wasn't malevolent, not exactly, but it didn't care whether you returned. It twisted paths, hid holes, muffled sound. Trees that looked friendly in daylight turned sinister by dusk. Every shadow moved, every branch reached, and in the thickest parts, even birds went silent. Aodan entered only when he had to. Firewood, wild mushrooms, a trap to check. He never brought the children. Mayreed didn't need to ask why. Wolves were the easiest danger to name. Ireland, in those days, still had them. Gaunt, clever beasts that travelled in silence and vanished faster than they came. They didn't snarl at you. They watched, waited, took the weakest animal or the slowest person. Aodan had seen one once, as a boy, perched on a rock across a glen. Its eyes glowed gold in the twilight. It didn't move. Neither did he. The next day, his cousin's goat was gone. Wolves, though, could be understood. Avoided, shot with arrows if you had the nerve. But raiders, they were human, which made them worse. The sea brought more than fish. It brought ships, narrow, low-slung boats that rode the waves like knives. The Norse had mostly become neighbours by Aodan's time, settled in coastal towns and church pews. But stories lingered. Of earlier raids, when iron-clad men with pale eyes and long beards came roaring out of the fog, burning huts, taking children, breaking bones. Those memories didn't die easily, especially not inland. Now the raiders came from closer to home. Other clans, hungry or greedy or both. Boundaries were flexible. Honour was negotiable. If your village had a surplus and theirs did not, the law of the blade spoke louder than Brehon rhyme. So you watched the woods, you posted boys on hills. You buried your barley sacks beneath nettle beds and smeared dung over your butter churns so it looked spoiled. They still came sometimes. Aodan remembered the spring raid. 4 men, masked in soot, with clubs and rusted iron. They took the pig, kicked in the door, broke Mayred's butter dish, left laughing. No one was killed. That was considered merciful. The priest said it could have been worse. Aodan spent 3 nights fixing the door with shaking hands. Mayreed didn't speak for 2 days. On the 3rd, she buried an iron nail in the doorway frame. Next time, she said, they won't laugh. Whether she meant the raiders or the spirits, Aodan didn't ask. But beyond wolves and men, the forest carried a deeper unease. Something older than threats. It was the feeling that something watched you, something that didn't blink or breathe but knew. They called them many things. The good folk, the others, the hidden ones. Never fairies allowed. That was like whistling in the graveyard. Everyone knew someone who'd heard music in the woods, too sweet and too sad to be human, or seen lights bobbing through the trees, or followed a child's laugh into the ferns and come back alone. Aodan had seen the ring once, a circle of mushrooms so perfect it hurt the eyes. He turned and walked the other way. Days later, a man from the next village, drunk and daring, stepped into one on a bet. They buried him 2 weeks later. No wounds, no marks, just empty. So yes, the woods were real. Not just trees and wolves, but stories, shadows, boundaries, and boundaries mattered. You never built a house on a fairy path, never cut hawthorn without apology, never took more than you needed, because while the church might forgive, the forest remembered. And sometimes the danger wasn't from things that walked, but things that whispered. Madness for one, isolation. Men who wandered into the wild and returned changed, if they returned at all. There were tales of men who forgot their names, women who danced in circles alone, humming songs that no one taught them. Aodan had seen a traveller once, hair matted with twigs, face blank as snow, walking barefoot with a bird's nest in his hand. No one stopped him. You didn't touch the touched. Even dreams turned sharper at the edge of the known. Aodan had once camped near a dolmen, a standing stone older than memory. That night he dreamt of a woman with antlers, kneeling in blood, whispering his name backwards. He woke choking on dirt. Mayor Reed said he screamed for a full hour. He didn't remember. And still they went. Into the woods, into the wild, because they had to. The forest gave as much as it threatened: firewood, fruit, hunted meat, bark for medicine, ferns to line cradles, mushrooms, if you knew which ones didn't lie. The wild was a danger, yes, but it was also a resource, a reluctant ally. It punished greed but rewarded respect, so Iodine walked gently. He stepped around roots, left offerings when he took too much, and thanked trees under his breath. He taught his sons to whistle while foraging, never sing. He never explained why. And when night fell too fast and the trail vanished and the air grew still, he lit a scrap of birch bark and whispered to Saint-Cyran, to Bridget, and to anything that might be listening. Because beyond the hedge, the rules were different, and no one came looking for those who forgot that. Boundaries in medieval Ireland weren't fences or lines on a map. They were felt, smelled, known by rhythm and instinct. For Aodon and his neighbours, boundaries were more than geography. They were warnings. You didn't need a sign to tell you when you were somewhere you didn't belong. The land told you. The birds changed pitch. The path narrowed. The air thickened. And your gut twisted in that familiar way that whispered, "Turn back." The world outside your tuath, your clan territory, wasn't just unfamiliar, it was dangerous. Not because it was filled with monsters or myths, though people believed in those too, but because you had no name there. No kin, no protection, no history. In a place-based society, your value was determined by who knew your father, who owed your uncle a cow, who saw you baptized. Step outside that web of recognition, and you were nobody. Being nobody could get you killed. Travel, even short distances, required caution. Aodine had only left his village a handful of times. Once for a funeral, once for a trade fair, once to return a borrowed ox. Each time he wore his cleanest tunic, carried a bone token with his clan's mark, and repeated his father's name at every meeting. The names of your kin were your currency. A man might rob a stranger, but not the cousin of a cousin who once shared mead in his grandfather's barn. And yet, even with careful words and a good cloak, mistrust hovered. Roads weren't safe, such as they were. Mud tracks bordered by thistle and bad luck. They wound through hills, bogs and dense forests that swallowed sound and never gave it back. There were no patrols, no milestones, no laws that reached beyond the village, only risk. You travelled with others if you could, you slept light, you hid anything worth taking. And that was assuming you weren't mistaken for someone else entirely. Raiding was common, feuds even more so. A man from the wrong village, at the wrong time, might be mistaken for an enemy and end up on the wrong end of a spear. Apologies came after blood, if at all. It wasn't personal. It was just the cost of not belonging. That's why most people never left, not truly. Their whole world lived within walking distance. The huts, the church, the fields, the forest edge, the river bend where the midwife bathed her linens. They knew every tree, every gossip, every legend tied to every rock. It was small, yes, but it was theirs, and most didn't dare test life without it. But even inside the village, boundaries existed. Aodine knew which men he could borrow tools from, and which ones would demand favours later. He knew which women would share herbs, and which would share rumours. He knew how far he could speak before his words might be twisted. This wasn't fear, it was navigation, social cartography. And he walked it daily. There were also the invisible boundaries of class. Everyone might eat the same turnip stew, but everyone knew whose cows were better, whose cloaks were newer, whose children had more meat on their bones. You didn't question it. You just adjusted your tone. Even ritual had limits. You could dance at the festival, but not too long. You could drink, but not louder than your host. You could laugh, but not when the priest was looking. The lines were drawn in looks and silences, in who was offered the first bowl, and who was asked to clean it later. Aodine hated those games, but he played them. because stepping over unspoken lines could ruin a man faster than famine. There were boundaries of gender too. Men didn't ask about childbirth. Women didn't interfere with hunting. Boys didn't cry in public, and girls didn't raise their voices. These weren't laws. They were expectations passed down like recipes, soaked into the fabric of life until they seemed natural. Mary pushed against them quietly. She knew healing better than the midwife, handled knives better than some men. But she spoke of it only at night when the children were asleep and the hearth was the only witness. There were even spiritual boundaries. Places where saints stopped and shadows started. The priest blessed homes, yes, but there were doors even he didn't knock on. Fields where he wouldn't sprinkle holy water. Old stones he walked around, not over. Not because of doctrine, but because belief was layered and even the righteous weren't foolish. People spoke of thin places, spots where the world seemed to stretch too tight, like skin over bone, where voices echoed too long, where wind moved against the trees. These were boundaries too, between this world and the next. You didn't build there, you didn't shout there, you didn't sleep there. Aodan knew one, a clearing near the northern field, perfectly round, where nothing grew except white grass and silence. No one ever said it aloud, but everyone avoided it, even the cows, even the crows. And there were emotional boundaries. Things you didn't say, feelings you didn't name. Grief, especially, was private. When Aodan's brother died in a ditch 2 winters back cut down during a raid, there was no mourning in the open, just a quiet funeral, a slightly thicker line of ash on the hearthstone, a deeper crease between his father's eyes. You moved on, you worked, you endured. Anything else was weakness, or worse, invitation. Because in a world where pain hovered like mist, too much feeling was risky. If you cried too long, people whispered. If you laughed too loud, people stared. Stability was a performance. You were expected to walk the line, so Aodan learned to feel inside fences. Joy, sorrow, anger, longing. They all had their place. And when they leaked out, as they sometimes did, you mumbled a prayer and offered it to the wind. Let the wind carry it. Let the wind understand. And still, people longed to cross lines. Some did. A young girl who ran off with a traveller. A boy who vanished after claiming to see lights in the forest. A woman who left her husband and went to live near the stones. They became stories. Warnings. Myths. Not condemned, but not welcomed back either. The village needed its boundaries. It needed the hedge, the fence, the rhythm. Because without them, life would become nothing but exposure. Raw skin on cold stone. Aodan didn't hate the boundaries. He respected them, feared them sometimes, but he also watched them, like someone watching a locked door and wondering what's behind it. Not to open it, but just to remember there was more. Because boundaries protected, but they also trapped. Chapter 11. Love, Marriage and the Loneliness. Between. If you asked Aodan whether he loved Myraid, he'd probably blink at you like you'd asked if grass was green or if the wind blows west in March. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because the question itself didn't exist in his world the way it does in ours. Love wasn't a word you used often, not in front of people, not even in private. It was lived, not said. It showed up in the way she wrapped cloth around his cracked hands when the cold got in. It was in the way he stood between her and the door during storms. That was it. That was everything. Marriage in medieval Ireland was many things. It was a contract, first and foremost. A transaction of cows, land, and obligation. A negotiation between 2 families, more than between 2 hearts. But that didn't mean affection was absent. It just grew differently, like moss on stone, slow and silent, but stronger than it looked. Aodan hadn't chosen Mairead. His father had spoken to her uncle after a summer of failed barley and too many unwed girls in the village. She came with no dowry, only a spinning wheel and a sack of hard apples. They were married by the riverbank with 2 witnesses, a priest and a loaf of sour bread. There was no poetry. Just nods, oaths, and a night in a cold bed. No romance, just practicality. And yet she stayed, through 30 harvests, through coughs and stillbirths. through failed traps and cracked beams and winters so cold, the ink in your thoughts froze solid. She stayed, not because she had no choice, though options were few, but because the staying itself became a form of love. Love in those days wasn't fireworks, it was repetition. Fetching water, sewing torn sleeves, sharing the last crust without asking, enduring each other's silence without making it heavier. Affection was never spoken aloud. It was tucked in alongside the blanket at night, squeezed between chores, stitched into the edges of a shirt. They bickered often, about goats mostly, and firewood, and whose turn it was to clean the ash from the hearth. But it was never venomous, just the friction of two lives rubbing together so closely that sparks were inevitable. If they yelled, they made up by sitting near the same fire again. That was enough. Not all marriages were as steady. Some men drank too much and hit too hard. Some women left in the night. Others stayed out of fear or shame or the dull inertia of routine. The church didn't permit divorce, but Brehon law, older, earthier, did. A woman could walk away, especially if mistreated. But where would she go? There were no apartments, no independence, just another man, another uncle, another arrangement. Mayrede had once told Eodan about a girl who walked barefoot to the next village after her husband broke her ribs. She lived with a beekeeper for 3 months before being dragged back by her brother. The bees stung her less than he did, Mayrede said, chopping leeks. Eodan said nothing. He just sharpened his blade slower that day. There were romances, of course. In stories, ballads, myths, lovers who defied clans, gods who married mortals. But those belonged to poets, not peasants. Real love was quieter, rougher, worn down like the soles of a shoe but still holding. Courtship, such as it was, consisted of stolen glances at festivals, whispered jokes during harvest, shared loaves and careful compliments. A girl might be admired for her bread or her butter, not her beauty. A boy might be praised for the way he chopped wood, not for his smile. There was no flirting, just assessment. Could you survive together? Could you share silence? Lust was different. It was urgent, secretive, shameful, and inevitable. The priest preached against it. The village gossiped about it. But it happened, behind hedges, during long summers, after too much mead. Illegitimate children were raised anyway, sometimes passed off as nephews, sometimes given to monasteries. No one admitted. Everyone knew. Loneliness, however, was the quiet plague. You could live in a hut with 5 people and still feel alone, especially if the talking dried up, especially if the love you had was more duty than desire, especially if the other person was just there. Mayrede once said that silence was louder in marriage than in mourning. At least the dead weren't expected to speak. Eodan understood. Some nights, after the fire dimmed and the children slept and the roof dripped a rhythm into the dark, he would lie awake, not from pain, not from fear, but from distance. The kind that crept in between 2 people who had shared everything except their thoughts. He never told Mayrede, she never asked. And yet there were moments, when she smoothed the back of his neck after a fever, when he brought her a wild onion and didn't say why, when she fixed his shirt for the 3rd time and muttered, "Try not to rip it again." These were the threads of their connection, unspoken, unpolished, unbreakable. Other villages had different arrangements. Some marriages were loveless but calm. Some were affectionate but fraught. A few were disasters. Once, a couple in a nearby tuath fought so loudly for so long that the priest declared their marriage a form of public penance. He was only half joking. And some people didn't marry at all. Old widows lived alone, spinning stories into their yarn. Bachelors hunted too much and spoke too little. The village tolerated them, pitied them, feared becoming them, but no one judged too harshly. Because they knew companionship was survival. Someone to stoke the fire when you were sick, someone to sit beside your grave when the time came. That was love, not roses, not poems, just presence. Eodan never wrote Mayrede a love letter. He couldn't write. But he once carved her name into a birch tree near the field where they first met. He did it with a blunt knife and a shaking hand. The bark healed over it eventually, but she saw it, and she smiled. That was enough. Grief, in Aodan's world, didn't arrive like thunder. It came slow, like fog down a hillside, like the steady drip of rain through a broken roof. Death was so common it barely stirred the air, but loss, real loss, lingered. When a spouse died, there were no counsellors, no books to make sense of it, no soft-voiced priests whispering about closure. There was just absence, an empty bowl, a colder bed, one fewer breath by the hearth. Mary had seen it first. Her mother, folding slowly inward like old parchment after her husband died of a wasting sickness. She still spun thread, still fed the goats, still spoke at Mass, but something was missing from her eyes. Not tears, something worse, purpose. She drifted through her final winter like smoke, never fully returning. When she passed, Mary didn't cry. She just stood over the grave, pressed her fingers to the soil and said, "That's the second death." Aodan didn't understand that until years later. When old Niall died, his hut 2 down from theirs, he was buried by the stone wall behind the church. His wife Brona had no sons left, no daughters nearby. For weeks after, she kept setting 2 bowls for supper. She never touched the second one, no one mentioned it. Then one day, she stopped coming outside. When they found her, she was sitting in her chair, wrapped in his old cloak, her mouth open as if trying to speak a name that wouldn't come. Grief had taken her quietly, like it often did. Even marriages built more on duty than love had, roots so deep that tearing away left people limping. You got used to someone, their breathing, their habits, their sounds. Then they were gone. The silence they left was louder than any argument you ever had. Mayreed knew that too. She once told Aodan, during a particularly cold night after the children had all fallen asleep, "I don't fear dying. I fear going first. I don't trust you to eat properly without me." He laughed, of course, but not fully. Because the truth was, she was right, women were often the ones left behind. Men died in raids, in fields, from accidents and infection. The women endured, and they did so without expectation of romance or even remembrance. A widow had value if she could still cook, still spin, still raise children. If not, she became a burden or a cautionary tale. There was no romanticised idea of eternal love, just the grit of survival and the stubborn thread of connection that sometimes outlasted the body. Some widows never remarried, choosing instead to talk to their late husbands like they were still in the next room. Some men took new wives within weeks because food still had to be made, beds still needed warmth, and children couldn't raise themselves. Aodan had once judged such a man. His cousin, who remarried before his first wife's grave, had moss. But then Mayreed got sick one winter. A bad cough, a hollowing. For days, Aodan thought he might lose her. And during those nights, while the wind beat at the shutters and the children slept with their arms around each other, he realised something awful. He wasn't scared of being alone. He was scared of not knowing how to be alone. Of forgetting how to cook stew just the way she did. Of not knowing which herbs to use for fever. Of losing the rhythm of their shared silence. That was love, he supposed. Not fear of death, but fear of disconnection. She recovered. Eventually. But he never mocked his cousin again. The grief of partnership lost didn't always look like mourning. Sometimes it looked like quiet confusion, like sleeping on the wrong side of the bed for months, like hearing a sound and forgetting that the person you'd always shared it with was no longer there to hear it too. The church told them to trust in the next world. That reunion awaited, that God saw all bonds and blessed them beyond death. But few believed it fully, or at least not in the way it was preached. If anything, people imagined their lost ones still lingering, at the foot of the bed, at the edge of the field, in the smoke curling from the pot. Mayreed once said her grandmother visited her in dreams, not as comfort, but as reminder. She tells me to get up, to stir the porridge before it burns. Maybe that was how love worked in this world, not eternal bliss, just enduring presence long after the body broke. Even while alive, many couples moved through stretches of emotional absence, times when the bond felt more like obligation than affection. But even then they remained tethered by shared memory, by griefs too old to recount, by joys too brief to forget. Sometimes that tether frayed. Some partners left, not physically, but in spirit. Aedan once watched his friend Cormac sit across from his wife for a whole meal and not say a word. She didn't either. Something between them had gone out, not violently, just slowly, like coals fading in a hearth. No one said anything, but everyone noticed. It was the opposite of death. It was emotional erasure. Mairead feared that kind of end more than any grave. "Better to bury you than to forget you while you sit right beside me," she said once, wringing water from cloth. He didn't reply, just placed his hand over hers. It was rough. So was hers. But they understood. Affection was maintenance, like thatching, like mending a sock. If you ignored it, it tore. And eventually, the wind got in. Not every couple was lucky, not every love was gentle, but the ones that lasted shared more than labour. They shared the weight of being seen by at least one other person in a life that otherwise passed unnoticed. Aedan never said, "I love you," but he remembered how Mairead used to braid the grass when she was nervous, how she hummed while peeling onions, how she always saved the softest bit of bread crust for the youngest child. And Mairead, in turn, remembered how he always counted the cows aloud, even when alone, how he tapped his knee 3 times before sleep, how he whistled the same 3-note tune when he was thinking hard. These were the details that remained after death. These were the griefs that tasted like memory. And in a world where you owned so little, sometimes those small fragments of someone else's presence were the only things you could keep. Chapter 12. The Weight of Legacy. What was left behind. Legacy, for someone like Aedan, wasn't a grand notion. It wasn't castles or crests or names etched in ink. It was smaller, earthier. A well-dug field. A son who knew how to sharpen a blade. A daughter who remembered the old prayers. It was the rhythm of habit passed down by hands that had blistered, cracked, and bled without ever asking for applause. In medieval Ireland, you didn't chase legacy. You planted it, hoped it took root, and then moved on with your back bent under a different burden. Aedan had never thought of himself as important. He didn't own much, 3 cows, a few plots of barley, a hut he'd repaired more than he'd built. But he had continuity, and in a world where life slipped away like mist, that was a kind of wealth. Each season survived was a monument. Each harvest not ruined, a song. The world didn't need him to be remembered. There were no scribes waiting to document his efforts. No children's tales that would include his name. But every fence post he pounded in, every ditch he dug, every stubborn seed he coaxed from the soil that was memory. Not his, but the land's. And land, he believed, remembered everything. He could feel it sometimes, in the stillness of an early morning, when the fog hugged the hills like a second skin. The weight of footsteps behind his own. Not ghosts exactly, but echoes. Of men who'd stood on the same soil with the same worries. Would it rain too much? Not enough? Would the cow birth cleanly? Would the child's fever break? Nothing ever changed, really. The faces shifted, the hands aged. But the question stayed. And what would his children inherit? Not wealth, not comfort, but skill. Story. Caution. He taught them when not to walk in the woods, how to look at the sky and know if they'd need to cover the grain sacks. He showed them how to mend a cracked pot with ash paste, how to sing while working to keep the silence from settling too deep. These were not teachings found in books. These were the inheritances of survival. Mairead too wove legacy into every day. She stitched it into clothes, folded it into loaves, whispered it into her daughter's ears while brushing their hair. Not all wisdom was loud. Some of it was passed on in glances, in the way you held a hot kettle, in the way you bit your tongue when a neighbour spoke foolishly. And yet, even with this quiet diligence, the idea of lasting permanence always felt slippery. How could anything last when roofs caved, bones broke, memories faded? Aedan often wondered, would anything he'd done still matter 50 years after he died? 100? Would a child's footstep land where his once had? Would they know he'd once stood there, cold and hungry, eyes toward the sky, asking for something better? He doubted it, but that didn't matter. Because in this life, you didn't leave legacies to be admired. You left them because someone might need them. Someone might find your old hoe handle and fix it again. Someone might repeat the planting rhyme you taught your son. Someone might, years from now, look out at a stone wall and feel safer knowing someone once stood there and stacked each rock with care. There were no tombstones for men like him, just hills and hedgerows and silence. But sometimes silence was enough. Occasionally he wondered what might happen if he hadn't lived at all. Would anything be different? Would the world have noticed? The crops would still grow or not? The rain would still fall or not? But then he'd look at his children, mud on their boots, hair full of wind, and feel a steadiness inside. He had shaped them, and they would shape others. That was more than enough. The church spoke of heaven, of rewards after death, of golden cities and singing choirs. Aodan wasn't sure what he believed. He hoped there was something after, a fireless place, a clean one. But even if there wasn't, he thought, this life wasn't wasted. He'd made it through. He hadn't abandoned anyone. He hadn't grown cruel. He had stayed. In Ireland, land stayed. Names didn't. That's why people told stories. Not big ones, not heroic sagas, just family tales, stitched into memory by repetition. The time Da faced the bull with only a broken rake. The time Mam caught a fish with her bare hands because the line snapped. These things became myths in their own way. Humble myths, but real. And there were darker legacies too. Resentment, silence, fear. Sometimes what you passed down wasn't wisdom, but weight. Aodan tried not to let that happen. He tried to tell his sons it was okay to cry when the cow died, that it was okay to rest when your back gave out. Mareed said he was too soft. But then she wept for an hour when the old cat passed. Legacy wasn't just what you said. It was what you modelled, even when you didn't mean to. The older he got, the less he feared death, and the more he feared being forgotten badly. Not forgotten entirely, that was inevitable, but misremembered, as harsh when he tried to be kind, as distant when he was simply tired. That's why he lingered longer over bedtime stories, why he left little carved things in the children's pockets. He never explained. They never asked. He didn't want to be a legend. He just wanted to be a memory worth keeping. As the seasons turned, so did his body. The strength that once lifted stones now strained to lift the bread bin. His knees spoke in cracks. His breath shortened. But still, each morning he stood outside the hut and looked out at his fields. Some patches grew nothing, some grew weeds, others surprised him with green. That, he thought, was legacy in its truest form. You plant what you can, you water it, you hope. And even if it's not you who harvests, someone will. That was the point. Aodan's world, like the earth he tilled, gave nothing easily. Not comfort, not rest, not clarity, but it gave endings, quiet ones, uneventful ones. The sort of endings that didn't look like grand conclusions, but instead resembled dusk, slow, certain, barely noticed, until the sky was already dark. And in that soft, dimming light, men like Aodan found peace, not in celebration or reward, but in stillness. The final years didn't come with horns or omens, they came with silence, with fewer steps taken each day. With a growing awareness that the hill behind the field had become harder to climb. He stopped lifting the heavier sacks, stopped tending the furthest row. The field didn't care. It kept growing things, or not, without him. That was humbling, and oddly comforting. Mareed noticed before he did she began rising earlier, taking on the morning chores without waiting for his groan. Not because he couldn't, but because she knew his shoulders had lost some of their stubbornness, knew he stared longer at the fire, as if trying to remember something that never had a name. They didn't speak of death, not out of fear, but because it felt impolite, like rushing a guest who was already on his way. Instead, they spoke of small things. Which wool was best for mending? Which corner of the roof might need patching next spring? They made future plans, both knowing some of them would go unmet. Aodan didn't fear dying, but he feared leaving loose ends. So he walked with his eldest to each corner of the land, pointing out the frost pockets, the shaded furrows, the stone that always marked the end of the workable soil. He spoke more than usual. The boy listened with the quiet intensity of someone finally realizing that everything ordinary was sacred. He gave away tools, not in a grand ceremony, but in small, quiet offerings. A knife to a nephew, a chisel to a neighbour, a carved comb to his youngest, who blushed and hid it. These weren't heirlooms, they were pieces of him, transferred not for memory's sake, but for utility. If they lasted, so would he. Winter arrived sharp and early that year. The wind howled through the cracks like it had always done. The fields lay barren, except for the stubble and the frost that glittered like salt on a wound. Aodan moved slower now, wrapped in furs he once thought too fine to wear. He sat more often, stared longer. When the priest came by and spoke of confession, he nodded politely. But his real prayers were older, quieter, murmured, thanks to the land, to the sky, to the cows that had never wandered too far. At night the fire seemed brighter than it used to, not because it burned hotter, but because the darkness around it had grown larger. The children sat closer. Mare Reed kept the kettle warm. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't need to. When the pain started, low, dull, spreading like a slow spill, he didn't fight it. He simply adjusted, stood with more care, slept more deeply, woke later. He didn't speak of it. No one asked. Then one morning he didn't get up. Mayraid found him just before dawn, eyes closed, breath shallow. She didn't cry, not yet. She sat beside him, folded his hands, and waited, not for a miracle, but for the end to finish arriving. He died just after first light. There was no screaming, no thunder, just breath, then no breath, just warmth, then stillness. They buried him behind the hut, near the tree he'd planted the year their second daughter was born. The priest came, said the words, blessed the ground. A few neighbours attended, though the cold kept most away. Mayreed stood straight through it, not stiff, just present. Afterward she boiled onions, told the children to eat, folded the bedclothes, stared at the fire, and then, finally, allowed herself to weep, not for herself, but for the sound of him, the rhythm, the weight in the room that was now gone. And that's what death meant in Aodan's world. Not disappearance, but dispersal. He became memory in fingers that still knew how to tie knots, in tools that still bore his grip, in fields that still grew in the order he had set. He became part of the silence, part of the soil, part of the rhythm that no one questioned because it had always been there. The children didn't speak of him much, not because they forgot, but because he had become part of everything. His name wasn't needed to feel his presence. It was in the way the gate creaked, in the way the bread rose, in the way the youngest now whispered over the cows before milking, just like he had done. Legacy, in the end, wasn't about glory, it was about echo. And in that, Aodan had succeeded, because somewhere, in a hut near a windswept hill, a child still asked, "How did Da do it?" And someone older would answer, with a voice worn by weather and time, like this. And so he lived. Not forever, but long enough. If I were to sit back now and truly imagine myself in Aodan's boots, mud-caked, cracked and barely holding together, I wouldn't romanticize it. No, not even for a second. Because as much as we've built this long, aching portrait of survival, the truth is his entire life was a slow, quiet injustice. Let's be honest, that wasn't living. That was enduring. This wasn't some poetic, noble peasant existence. It was a cycle of suffering, bending to the will of land that gave nothing freely, ruled by laws that favoured the cattle more than the child, and bound by a faith so tangled in superstition it blurred the line between reverence and fear. They didn't live under justice, they lived under ritual, and ritual without power is just oppression in disguise. And the worst part, they didn't even question it. They were born into this system that told them, suffer quietly and you'll be remembered. But remembered by whom? The dirt? The stones? Legacy for them was the luxury of being mourned in silence. If we were there, if somehow we had the knowledge we carry today, what could we have done differently? Could we have fixed it? Maybe not entirely. But I know this. We would have recognized the value of shared knowledge. They had herbalists with deep ancestral wisdom, but that wisdom lived and died in whispers. No ink, no preservation, no community learning, just secrets. If even a fraction of them had pooled their skills, written their seasons, tracked what worked and what failed, they could have started a true agricultural memory, a system, a base for growth. Their isolation was their poison. Every family functioned like its own island. Imagine if they'd built something like cooperative networks, shared seed banks, food storage, rotating child care, or even rudimentary labour exchanges. Even without advanced tools, shared time is a powerful tool. They didn't need steel, they needed structure. And faith? It gave them comfort, yes, but it also kept them scared. Too scared to challenge anything. I don't blame them, fear was the only currency they had. But if we were there, we would have spoken up when the Brehon ruled unfairly. We would have asked why someone's pain cost fewer cows than another's pride. We would have known that fairness isn't born from tradition, it's born from courage. Even the women Mirad and the others, they bore everything. They stitched society together with blood and bone, yet they were never allowed to lead it. If we had been there, we would have made sure their knowledge wasn't just tolerated, but trusted. They were healers, midwives, decision-makers in secret. They deserved the front seat at the fire. And maybe, just maybe, we'd have planted fewer seeds in the soil and more in the minds of those around us. Because a village that only grows grain and not thought will never feed the future. But here's the tragedy. They didn't even know they deserved better. That's the real grief. Not that they suffered, but that they believed it was normal. So if we were there, we wouldn't fight the rain, or the wolves, or the rocks in the field. We'd fight the silence. Because silence, not death, is what buries people the deepest.